This week's Dominaria's Judgment is brought to you, as always, by StarCityGames.com and the StarCityGames.com weekly sale, where it is once again time to protect what you collect. Save 25% on select Magic the Gathering supplies until Monday, August 9th at 10:59 a.m. Head over to StarCityGames.com/sale, and whether it's time to re-sleeve a cube while listening to the 540, or if you just need a fancy mousepad to play the SCG Tour online that happens to turn into a playmat for when that qualifies you for the upcoming SCG Invitational in Roanoke, Virginia, you can find it on sale right there this week. And if you're just looking for cardboard, don't worry, because every Monday at 11 a.m. a new sale starts at StarCityGames.com/sale, and you might just find exactly what you're looking for. This week's Dominaria's Judgment is also brought to you by Coalesce Apparel, the #1 store for Magic the Gathering inspired apparel. Take a look at their t-shirts, hoodies, stickers, and just general stylings at coalesceapparel.shop. Then use gift code SCG at checkout to save 10% on your entire order. And seriously, I want to emphasize that sticker part. Shirts are cool, but you can send a targeted message with the sticker. Slap it on your deck box if it matches your commander, or if you really want to get inventive, find a way to slap the 3x4 sticker on your 2.5x3.5 Magic card, maybe with a sleeve, maybe with a hard case. You're inventive people. You'll find a way to make it work. So take a look at coalesceapparel.shop, check out their product lines like Wooburg Forever and Ravnica University, and see what catches your eye. Remember, use gift code SCG at checkout to save 10%. Coalesce Apparel and Design. No one made what they wanted, so they made it themselves. If you are looking to sell your Magic the Gathering cards, it's never been easier than with StarCityGames.com. Make the best of our 30% store credit bonus and the fastest turnaround time in the industry when you use any of our 4 simple ways to sell located at StarCityGames.com/sell. You can check out our buy list, box up your cards and send them our way with the ship and sell program. Come on into the Star City Game Center in Roanoke, Virginia for that personal touch. Or if you have everything, 500,000 cards, you want to store and you want to do some bulk, we'll come to you. And seriously, when we're talking about these large collections, Star City does mean they will come to you. The list of places goes from Ohio to New Jersey and elsewhere. Like, seriously, I've driven from Ohio to New Jersey. That is not a short drive. So head on over to StarCityGames.com/sell, that's SELL, for more details on all these great options, and maybe clear up a little space in your life for your next project, even if that happens to just be even more Magic cards or another Commander deck.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 17 of Dominaria's Judgment, a weekly modern podcast brought to you by StarCityGames.com. I'm Dom Harvey, and here with me to go through all the colors of the rainbow, except for one, I suppose, is Ari Lax.
Yeah, I have preliminarily titled this episode as the Ink Treader one, but I don't think that is stylistically allowed, so we'll have to come up with a new name.
Yeah, always down to name that Nephilim, but I feel like Omnath may have stolen Ink Treader Nephilim's thunder here forevermore now.
Yeah, good old Cheeto fingers here, just living it up.
Yeah, card design philosophy has changed a little bit in, the 15 years since good old Guild Pack. So mixing it up a bit with some more powerful cards here. But we have another weekend of modern results to sink our teeth into. And this includes the Modern Showcase that we had this past weekend. This seasonal event that brings a lot of the top competition out to play here. And I guess last weekend, you could say, was the breakout weekend for the Elementals deck following Canis's challenge win, which it won the challenge, and it was Canis who won the challenge. So that was guaranteed to get a lot of eyeballs on the deck. But unclear if that was going to convert into results in future weeks. And the answer now definitively is yes. Yes, it will.
Yeah, there were 3 Elementals decks at the top 8 of the showcase, correct?
Yes, and all of them have their own quirks, shall we say, to them. The same basic core, but then some flex slots, which people are making good use out of.
Yeah, I do think so. Before we get into the flex slots, I kind of want to talk about the mana, and that's a pretty good place to start, because one of the things we'll see is that 2 of these lists are kind of uniquely, I don't want to say outdated, but throwback to like the earlier builds of Elementals. But they're using the fetch shock mana base and not the like primal beyond mana base, despite not really having spells that you can only cast off of like
actual mana.
Yeah, so that's one of the main dividing lines, and it is kind of sad that literal Primal Beyond, the elemental Rainbow Land, which you think would be a shoo-in for a deck like this, because you have so many non-elemental spells that require actual colored mana, that card gets edged out, and if you have room for some amount of that effect, then you're going to go to Cavern of Souls first and foremost, of course.
Yeah, and I guess to kind of go into the lands, we can talk about Wrenn and Six a little bit in these decks. One of these lists is this is the 5th place list, is all Wrenn and Sixes, no Teferis, and pairing that with Titania, Protector of Argol.
Yeah, so Titania is a really interesting addition to this deck, and it's a card which I was very excited to see join the modern format through MH2, because you don't really get to cast this card in Legacy because there are some constraints on you doing that there. But when you do, it's a hell of a lot of fun. And so this is 3 GG for a 5/3. When it enters the battlefield, you return a land from your graveyard to play. And when a land goes to your graveyard from play, you create a 5/3 elemental. And Titania is an elemental itself. So you can already start to envision the curve with Risen Reef, where maybe you play Risen Reef on turn 3. Turn 4, you play Titania, you get a Risen Reef trigger, Titania returns a fetch land, you crack the fetch land, you get a 5/3, which gets you another Risen Reef trigger, and already that's just a massive snowballing advantage that's going to be very tough to recover from. But in a deck which has both Flamekeep and Harbinger to get the one Titania, so you have access to that card without risking just drawing a bunch of them and not being able to cast them, but also Omnath Locus of Creation, which already incentivizes you to play a bunch of fetch lands, but also you want to have, ideally, 5 drops to use that big burst of mana when you play Omnath and play a fetch land in the same turn. And if you're playing and cracking a fetch land, a 5-drop that returns a fetch land is a nice way to chain that back together. You even get the 3rd landfall trigger from Omnath immediately, just dealing 4 to the opponent and all of their planeswalkers, like any Wrenn and Sixes, Wrenns and Six, I suppose, or Teferis that may be lingering around.
Yeah, so with that immediately out of the way, let's start at back up at the top of that 1st place list. This is a slightly more than 4-color deck. There's an Indatha Triome in order to cast a single Lightning Skelemental, it looks like.
Sure. And the Lightning Skelemental used to be the main focus of these very primitive elementals list before we had the various evoke creatures from MH2. Back when you were doing stuff like Thunderkin Awakener for Lightning Skelemental, both of those were for us. That was the gimmick. That was the centerpiece of the deck. And this deck, I guess, is trying to relive those, not glory days, because the deck wasn't good back then and very much is good now. But it's certainly a blast from the past there.
Yeah. And to go with that, the Thunderkin Awakener is like supporting a toolbox in this deck almost. And it's kind of interesting because Thunderkin Awakener, one of the things it returns is Flamekin Harbinger.
Yeah, so you can... you almost have to engineer a way for the Harbinger to die early, but once you do, like maybe that just involves trump blocking, taking one for the team, jumping in front of a Ragavan, then yeah, Awakener can bring that back, or you can Awakener for the Harbinger that gets back the... you can Harbinger for the Awakener that gets back the Harbinger. There we go. And then just chain a bunch of these effects together. We have a Vesperlark where the Awakener can get back the Vesperlark, and then that can get back something else to get an accidental extra Risen Reef trigger in there. And then Risen Reef itself, of course, is a target for the Awakener. The main Awakener target outside of Skelemental, which we've seen in the past, is Spy Bellows, which... even though you have Fury and Solitude to cover a lot of that same ground now, Spy Bellows is just, if you're willing to pay mana rather than a card, Spy Bellows often is the best version of that effect. And so we've got one of those here joining the fray. I do think this whole package is more cute than good for the most part. I don't think you need the Awakener stuff, and just casting more of these good monocolored or multicolored non-elemental spells is the way to go. The one innovation in this list that I really do like, though, is the Tangled Florahedron, because this is a deck which is very mana hungry, and the ability to Harbinger for a land is something that I really wish I had in a lot of games, where you have, let's say, a 2-lander with a Harbinger, and you want to draw lands to get up to your Risen Reef or your other expensive spells. but you also want to deploy the Harbinger early, but just you want to use the Harbinger, right? Just playing red for a 1/1 is not a great play in Modern or really any format. So having the ability to not just use Harbinger for something, but use Harbinger as mana fixing of sorts and a way to guarantee an extra land drop, I think adds a useful dimension to the deck. And I think regardless of what build you play, that's a tool that you do want to have access to.
Yeah, let's just talk for a minute about Harbinger, because that card, it went from like questionable whether it should be in the deck to just like outright staple, and that card is awesome. Not only is it extending your like toolbox by finding endurance in game ones, or finding your solitudes and fury, so you're effectively extending those, or like doing the awesome thing where it triggers Risen Reef and you directly get the card into your hand, but like it is finding your foundation breakers to beat a Blood Moon.
Yeah, which is increasingly important as the Is It Murktide decks, as we heard from our guest Milan Bayana last week, those decks still hovering around the top of the modern format, even if they didn't quite break through again this weekend. And so having that flexibility is really important. And yeah, if you think of this as a Risen Reef combo deck of sorts or an Ephemerate combo deck, Harbinger is the card that sets up the Risen Reef and then is great when you have the Risen Reef. And then if you really need that Fury or that Spike Bellows or that Endurance, it gets you there. And if you need the ideal target to pair with the Ephemerate, then Flinkham Harbinger has you covered. And so even though it certainly can be a bit of a Moby card, and it is a kind of thing which initially you go really hard on these elemental synergies, right, to see how far you can take it. And then as these lists become more and more refined, this is the type of card that would make its way out of the deck. As someone like a Jerry Thompson, for example, as they're refining a shell like this is the type of card which would get dropped for more universally useful and applicable tools. But I think in this deck, like this actually just is an important piece of the puzzle. And with Fury being a centerpiece of the deck too, you even have this buyout clause. If you draw a second Harbinger that you don't need, or just a dead first Harbinger, that's an ideal thing to pitch a Fury in a deck which doesn't actually have all that many red cards. And as you mentioned last time, if your red cards are all good, or your cards in a color are all good, that's almost a bad thing because you now don't have good things to pitch. You don't have expendable cards to pitch. And so having a kind of high variance card, if you like, in the form of a Harbinger is actually useful for the sake of padding your colored card count for these pitch creatures.
Yeah, I kind of want to talk about a different red card in that aspect, and that's Wrenn and Six. I did not find that card to be super impressive in this shell. Even though it does sort of do the land extending thing, I found that like the more important thing is when you get Risen Reef off the ground, you want to make sure it like actually goes somewhere. And having these Wrenn and Sixes kind of can clog you up. And that's at least been my experience.
Yeah, it's a very just good generic card of the sort that you would think would get added to the deck over time that doesn't really cohere with the main plan at all. That being said, I think having just a gold card that pitches to Fury or to Endurance, or especially Force of Vigor in your post-board games goes a long way. And, again, that decreases the impact of drawing a dead second copy when the first is already doing its work. And also, you are a somewhat mana-hungry deck, but you also can't afford to play too many lands, especially if you already have stuff like Utopia Sprawl trying to accelerate you up to that 3-drop mark. So I found Wrenn and Six to be a somewhat useful just bridge card. And yeah, sometimes it does great work shooting down a channeler, making them then spend an additional mana or a card, removing it with an Unholy Heat or something, which would have been earmarked for a Risen Reef otherwise. So I found it to be a good card. The one thing that does become apparent when you play not just with that card, but with the counter list. So we see Namasquats in 8th place, who I was brainstorming a bit with before the challenge and ended up playing a very similar list to his. The counter list has, in terms of non-elemental spells, you've got your 4 Teferi's, 2 Wrenn and Six, 4 Utopia Sprawl, 4 Ephemerate, and then Prismatic Ending. At that point, Cavern of Souls goes from being the best possible land that casts all of your spells to actually a somewhat conditional land that often doesn't cast your most important spells early. And that's a tension that I found with this build that led me to shave down on Cavern of Souls, which it feels like is not where you want to be forced to get to.
I think that might depend on exactly how many people are showing up with literal counterspell. I mean, I get that Cavern of Souls is a painless land and it does produce all of your colors, but these 4-color decks don't have the biggest issue with colors to begin with, and it feels like a lot of the Cavern of Souls utility is like half the like not taking damage, except for the part where like you're not even. One of the things about this elemental deck that's super weird is that like you don't actually have to play spells until turn 3, or at least like spend mana on them most of the time. So you have plenty of time to make your triomes just do their job or whatever and not take damage. But like you also really need to not take damage because at the same time that you're not casting spells, like you're not casting spells, and like the margins on I guess I don't want to go too far into what is going to end up being our main topic, but you have to pay a little bit more attention to the margins with this deck than you would with some of the decks that actually interact with the curve.
Right. So the mana base is less of a given than you might think, where with some of these 4-color decks, it almost becomes depressingly easy to build the mana bases where, all right, I have my 11 to 12 fetch lands, I got my triomes and a mix of shock lands, and you can be pretty sure you're going to be able to cast your spells, but that actually is not really the case when you have all of these different mana requirements and Omnath demanding this like specific spread of colors at a certain point in the game. So I do think some thought does need to go into how to build these mana bases. But once you do, you end up with a deck which is just very fundamentally powerful, and people learned that this weekend if they didn't know it already.
Yeah. I guess on the mana base point, maybe the thing that makes this deck unique among the 4-color decks is the doubles on the pitch elementals. Like if you look at the other lists, they don't really have this like white, red, green problem anywhere. They're pretty much single pipped or like heavy in a single direction. They're not being pulled all over the place.
And that's something in tactical terms, when the games are playing out, you do need to think about, especially in conjunction with Omnath. So, you need to think 2 turns in advance. All right, let's say I draw Omnath and get to play it with a fetch land, I need to be able to find a red source to cast, or let's say a white source to hardcast his Solitude. Ideally, I want that to be a basic plane so that I'm not taking an additional unnecessary 2 damage on the back end there. And so, maybe I keep this Windswept Heath in reserve and I use this Wooded Foothills instead that couldn't get that basic plains, for example. And that's the kind of thing you really do need to be thinking about in advance. And that's actually maybe where Wrenn and Six does help to remove those demands on you, where, all right, I use my fetch land, I get it back, and those kind of decisions or those resources are never really in short supply anymore.
That's totally fair. Wrenn does kind of make your mana easy for the rest of the game whenever you draw it.
And so the 8th place list, the canister throwback, this is the one list here that's using Utopia Sprawl, and that struck me as one of the more important innovations from the canister list. Just having that necessary speed in games where you don't have some ephemerate combo in the early game ready to go, and then sometimes your main plan, not even your secondary plan, but just all you want to do in the game is get to Fairy Time Raveler on the board as soon as possible, right? And Utopia Sprawl really helps to facilitate that. So I think Sprawl is an important part of the deck and worth making those sacrifices to build around, but then that does place these additional unique constraints on the mana base that have to be worked through in their own way.
Yeah, the counter argument to that is neither of the other 2 lists had to Fairy, so it's just less of a priority.
Well, sure, and those decks notably both had these 2 drops to bridge the gap. So instead of jumping from 1 to 3 or then 1 to, I guess, to 4 on turn 3, we're just casting 2 drops, right? We're casting Voice of Resurgence, casting Unsettled Mariner, Thunderkin Awakener, and so on. And easy to make fun of Voice of Resurgence, and for good reason, I think. But I've actually been a little impressed by that card in the context of all of the Murktide Regent decks and Ragavan decks and Grixis, or we saw in the hands of Eduardo Sajklik, I'm not sure which Nephilim this would be, but Grixis plus white for Prismatic Ending and Kaya's Guile in this top 32 here. And against all of those decks, I found Voice of Resurgence just as an elemental in itself that, again, pitches to 2 different things, and a way to put up a shield on the turn you cast your Risen Reef or cast your Omnath, where if they want to interact with it, they have to pay a pretty steep cost. And, if you're trying to put the shields up against Ragavan, for example, then you play a voice, and then if they kill it, you get another good blocker back to maybe interfere with that. So I think that card, you don't want too many of them, and it's only really good in a narrow range of matchups, but in those matchups, I think it is a useful card to have access to.
That all makes sense. Do you want to start talking about the other sort of archetype that put up 3x in this top 8? And that's Ragavan. I mean,
yeah, so
still great.
Yeah,
but
variations on a theme here, right? So we have the Mardu list in third place, where this is the Rakdos core, just touching white for Prismatic Ending and Kaya's Guile, and that really is the extent of it for the most part. I guess we do have 2 copies of Damn in the sideboard here, so we can get the double white out when you need that Wrath of God effect. But for the most part, this is definitively a Rakdos deck that's, acknowledging the limits of that color combination, and this is the simplest way to address those.
So there's actually multiple Rakdos decks in this top 8, and I had kind of made the statement in my article earlier this week that I didn't really understand the point of Rakdos now that Grixis existed, because it didn't feel like any of the things that Rakdos did, Grixis couldn't do. Do you have any thoughts on what might actually be going on there? Because it seems like expressive iteration is just like such a shoe-in here.
Yeah, I've learned over the past few months, it's hard to go wrong betting on expressive iteration, right? Like, that card has just overperformed and really impressed every single time I've seen it in action. I think maybe if Dalthy Voidwalker is a card that you want in the format, which doesn't strike me as where the format is at right now, which maybe is part of the confusion, but that would be an incentive to stick in a more heavy black base where, yes, in theory, you can support that in Grixis, but then you really can't afford to have a basic island in your deck anywhere, and the mana does start to become pretty messy at the best of times. So if the heavy black cards are a stronger incentive, then that would make sense to me. Or like Croxa, for example, which, same thing as applies to could go in Grixis, but maybe not such a good idea. Then that's a great way to outgrind these mirror matches potentially, if you think it's going to be a lot of is it Murktide and Grixis everywhere?
Maybe. I guess the other question is, how good is Croxa?
I don't know, honestly, right? Like, it feels against the Wrenn and Six decks, the idea of constraining their resources by attacking their hand like one card at a time just is fundamentally a non-starter. The card itself is more vulnerable in a world of Solitude and Prismatic Ending. So what you really want with Croxa is, in a very protracted game, you cast it once, it gets a card. You escape it again in a few turns. It gets a card when it comes in. They then have to deal with it. And then 2 or 3 turns down the line, you escape it again. And suddenly the one Croxa that was in your opening hand has, dealt 6 to 9 damage and traded for 4 to 5 cards, which is a pretty fantastic deal. And it feels like that sequence just both doesn't have the time to happen anymore, and also just the removal lines up in a way where you just don't get to do that, even if you do have the time.
Well, can Grixis beat a Croxa?
That's the question, right? I guess Eduardo can, right, with his Prismatic Endings and his Chaos Guiles, and that may be the incentive to go into a 4th color, stretching the mana base even further, if you think that kind of effect is what you need in these mirrors.
Yeah, I guess the follow-up argument is that, I'm looking at a TSB Genrek who top 4'd the Super Qualifier the previous weekend, and is now playing a completely Ragavan-less Grixis deck a little lower, and that deck could basically it's got 1 Cling to Dust. That's the plan. It's cold to Croxa otherwise.
Yeah, and TSB Yendrick, someone known for being a master of control in Modern in both good times and bad. And so no surprise to see them adopting this more reactive approach, I suppose. Cutting down on the Ragavans and trying a different route. But yeah, if that's what the opponent is doing, then yeah, I want to be casting Croxa once and then again until they finally tap off the mat.
A notable throwback just above that, on the other side of the interactivity spectrum, we have Luris Hexproof.
Oh, is this, I guess, Celestial Auras would be the style guide approved way to put this?
I think Hexproof is the bigger theme, but yeah,
okay.
I do enjoy how there's not even a single attempt at putting a core Spirit Dancer in the deck. Just like that card's time has passed, it dies, and we're just going to play with Ledgewalkers.
Yeah, I guess you can unholy heat my Dryad Arbor if you really want to, but yeah, other than that, we are really leaning into the Hexproof theme here, and maybe the most adorable feature of this deck list is the 3 copies of Mana Tithe in the main deck, which is a bold statement. I imagine there are a lot of people who slam their keyboards over the course of the weekend just getting some crucial spell Mana Tithe.
Oh yeah, I try to. I don't know if 3 or 2 is the more like 2 feels like a very mature number. Like you're like, I am making the mature decision. I'm putting 2 in my deck, not drawing a lot. 3 is like, I want to draw 2 sometimes, and my opponent will chuck their computer out of their window, and that will be my win condition.
Yeah, it feels like a one-off in the mold of the the Receivables A Borrow Palace in the Clouds award. Like Mana Tithe is the epitome of that card. 2 is the scientifically considered number, right? This is the I think the number that Rizor had in the White Weenie deck that won him a Pro Tour. 3 is a number that you play when you just want to grief as many people as possible. And, no aspersions cast on Josito Shekel, our 11th place finisher here, but if you're showing up with Boggles with main deck Mana Tithe, you've got to be built different, is all I'll say about that.
Yeah, well, if you're playing Hexproof, you're already bringing that kind of energy to the room, so there's not really a big difference between the first 4 Slippery Boggles and the next 3 Mana Tithes.
Let's talk about that as a strategic choice then, because Boggles is a deck which is very often the exact perfect choice for a tournament, and then in between those times, it is close to unplayable, right? It kind of very much exists at those 2 poles of the spectrum, and I don't know which pole it's honestly closer to at the moment, where if you look at some of these region decks or Grixis decks and so on, I guess if you're playing a Murktide region deck, I guess you have to hope to draw Blood Moon and resolve it in time, because otherwise you are not beating a giant first striking hexproof lifelink creature anytime soon. And likewise, the Grixis decks, I guess a timely Inquisition could line up well, in game 1 on turn 1, but other than that, their defenses are mostly down as well. And this is a world in which a lot of people have stuff like Engineered Explosives in their sideboard not for Boggles, like absolutely not for Boggles. That is just incidental hate for this archetype, but aiming at, let's say, the Colossus Hammer decks or some of the other decks with, these very low curves where maybe explosives can sweep up multiple permanents, you do run into some of that, but for the most part, there isn't the kind of targeted hate that you might think you need in order to keep a deck like this in check.
See, you're saying all this good stuff, and all I'm hearing is consistent decks with Engineered Explosives, and that just sounds like a nightmare.
It is a nightmare, yeah. And I think actually maybe even a bigger deal is a Prismatic Ending, where, those lines of are ending your Ethereal Armor and your Daybreak Coronet falls off and you are in a world of pain. It used to be that most decks just couldn't interact with enchantments because that's one of the features of the card type, right? It's the hardest one to interact with. And now that's not really true in quite the same way. So those free wins don't really exist in the same quantity anymore.
Yeah, I am significantly skeptical, but I appreciate that it's still here.
And also, if we think about Hammer Time as one of those litmus tests for the modern format still, this is a deck which I guess you can get overpowered by like a multiple hammer draw where they're dealing damage in even larger increments than you can lifelink your way out of. But other than that, you mostly beat them on the board. You have Path to Exile and Force of Vigor, of all things, in the sideboard, as well as Seal of Cleansing to interact with them. And so you're kind of being a more resilient version of their deck with better interaction for them. So I can imagine that matchup being very solid.
It might just depend on raw speed. They are significantly faster, I think. Like on the play, it's one of those things where like on the play they are going to outrace you basically every time, and on the draw they might be able to outrace you, which is like a really sketchy proposition. And also there's just like some weird negative interactions between Umbras and Inkmoth Nexus that don't go your way.
Oh, weird. Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that. Maybe it's one of those matchups where like you would rather be the deck on the play rather than get to choose what the deck is, if that makes sense. Like I could see that being the case.
Yeah.
But this is one of those decks where, depending on what you're playing yourself, your opponent plays Razorverse Thicket into Slippery Buckle, and you just get this sinking feeling in your stomach because you know that nothing you could possibly do is going to matter for the way this matchup is going to play out.
Yeah, and it is notable that a lot of the hate, aside from Force of Vigor, is very specifically directed at Colossus Hammer in ways that your deck is very able to avoid. Like, Abrade, who cares? Like, if someone has Ancient Grudge, who cares? Chalice, you probably care about Chalice of the Void, but
yeah, like
you can sidestep a lot of the stuff.
Wear Tear is kind of embarrassing as well, just like trading one card for one card. One thing that does stand out is it seems like on paper, this would be a very good game one deck against elementals, right? Where they just can't remove your thing. And so you stack up a bunch of auras on your thing, and their only recourse basically is to like try and gain enough life with Omnath to power their way through it. But that seems much easier said than done.
Yeah, that's not going to work. The only concerning thing is that if they get to ephemerate a Foundation Breaker, that's probably all that you could, like, you're just done. And like, I'm looking at the sideboard of the first place Elementals deck, and it's like 2 Chalice, that's not great. 2 Wear Tear, okay, that plays. Foundation Breaker that we can tutor for. Engineered Explosives, 2x. Force of Vigor.
Like, no. I said game one for a reason, okay? It's going to be,
okay.
You get the first one on the house, and then you have to steal one of the other ones somehow, but maybe you can do it. I will say, as like a 2017 era modern throwback, if this gets paired against the first place Tron deck as a flawless segue from the Sunday challenge, then it's lights out. There's nothing you can possibly do.
Oh yeah, absolutely nothing. It is let's talk about that Sunday challenge because it really felt like a blast from the past.
Yeah, when we were brainstorming our Nonsense of the Week candidates, I said that this Sunday challenge top 8 alone, could fill out that segment by itself. So let's dive into this here because it sounds like, oh my god, it's Karn Liberated's entrance music, Ari. Tron is back, and maybe not good again, but Tron is back at least for now.
Yeah, well, it's not even it's the other Karn, right? Because the event was won by Eldrazi Tron. And then the Tron deck that it faced off against in the finals was also a 4 Karn the Great Creator deck. And I'm just like looking at the cards that you can find with that Karn, and like one of them, we're talking about Elementals. Torpor Orb is the card that the Elementals players are just like, oh yeah, no one plays that, it's fine.
Right, that was going to be one of my talking points for this week is I would expect to see, and I would recommend you play, a lot more Torpor Orbs or Tocatli Honor Guards or whatever version of that effect works best with your own strategy. But for the most part, that is a sideboard card that your opponent has to draw in those sideboard games. And so maybe you can accept those odds. Against Karn the Great Creator, well, they have access to 4 virtual copies of that card in game 1. So, good luck and have fun.
Yeah, also Sundering Titan just like looking really good these days. If your opponent controls a Triome, it probably destroys all of their lands.
Yeah, if they have a Dryad of the Elysian Grove, then that's full Yahtzee. You get it all.
No, don't. Oh no, I'm gonna have nightmares. Yeah, the Tron list in second place might actually just have the hottest tech because the first place list is just Eldrazi Tron. We all know Eldrazi Tron. It's the same stupid cards. No offense to it, but like it's getting really hard after like so many years of seeing Eldrazi Tron not to have that kind of reaction to it. But the second place Tron list, let's start with Warping Whale, which is in a really awesome spot, also in the Eldrazi Tron deck. I think you mentioned this recently as well, but Warping Whale is a real hitter these days.
Yeah, you kind of get to use every part of the Buffalo on this card, whether it's exiling their 1-drop in Dragon's Rage Channeler or Ragavan, or countering a sorcery, which sounds quite restrictive, but in a world of Crashing Footfalls, Living End, Bring to Light, that comes up a lot more than you might think. And even just the making a Scion to either block or to ramp you to Thornotzer in the Eldrazi Tron deck or Karn the Great Creator in both decks in your non-Tron draws, just as a failsafe, like that comes up a lot too.
Yeah, I was going to say the other thing that comes up is ramping to Oblivion Stone when you just natural Tron them. but
Zero
Oblivion
copies.
Stone isn't even showing up. Yeah, I love that. I love to see that we're just going for efficiency these days. And then the other favorite thing that was pointed out to me was Tommy Ashton had been looking at this deck list. And he was like, wow, that's really ambitious. You're just going to beat Mill heads up with no sideboard Eldrazi. And then you just look at the main deck and the Kozilek is just there because, yeah, get wrecked, Mill.
That's not the only defense line we have against Mill. So we have 2 copies of Endurance in the sideboard in our deck with, I think, 8 main deck green cards, but we have a Yavimaya Cradle of Growth that we can get with our Expedition map to, just hardcast that thing for 2 green sources. On top of that, we also have 3 main deck Surgical Extraction. And that's not the kind of Magic Online results typo where, okay, this is clearly a sideboard card that got yanked into the main deck somehow. No, this is straight up, I want 3 copies of Surgical Extraction in my main deck, which I'm not quite sure what that is good against other than very unfortunate Reanimator players. But against Mill specifically, in the use case of if they are trying to mill you and then surgical a Tron land, you get to surgical that card in response, fail to find the other copies, and then leave those in your deck to continue to search for. So even with these 3 or 4 different pieces of tech against Mill, that still has to be a pretty horrendous matchup. That said, I guess I admire the ambition here of taking that harder stance.
Yeah, I really don't know what Surgical is trying to do. I don't get it.
Now, if you want to sell me on main deck Relic of Progenitus, which has been stock in Tron in the past, you could absolutely do that right now in the world of all of these DRC and Lurus decks and Drown in the Lock, even phenomenal against that card. And a lot of the mid-range decks have Wrenn and Six. I think Relic is in a fantastic spot. Sometimes you get paired against Living End and you get to cause them some grief in return. And that's a card which cantrips in your deck that's looking to assemble a 3-card combo before it does anything else. You can find it with Ancient Stirrings, like reasons why, even in Gindy's original list back in 2012, you saw Relic of Progenitus showing up. You could interest me in that. Mid-deck Surgical Extraction, not so much. I'm kind of confused by that one.
Yeah, you mentioned Living End. Surgical does not. They just have one's a snake, one's a sphinx, one's a bird. Like, you gotta choose a lane.
Here's what you do: you Warping Whale the Living End, and then you've assembled a Splinter Twin situation there.
Yeah, I did consider whether it was the kind of thing where you could beat the first Crashing Footfalls, but not the next 3. But then I immediately realized Wurmcoil Engine beats all of them forever, so who cares?
Yeah, Wurmcoil Engine seems like a fantastic card in this format right now. Unholy Heat does keep it in check a little bit against the type of deck where previously you would just play that card and laugh because it would solo their deck by itself. Now they can at least answer the front side, but then the 2 worms on the backside still could cause issues potentially. But if you want to tell me, all right, you can play Tron with main deck Relic, a bunch of Warping Whales, a bunch of Wurmcoil Engines, that sounds like a decent recipe to me, actually, because if you look at all of the very in-your-face anti-Tron cards, or I guess in theory they have other applications, but they are anti-Tron cards in MH2, like Break the Ice or the Obsidian Dragon thing, where it can, it gets discounted if they control a colorless land. No one is playing those cards, right? No one's playing Damping Sphere or stuff like that. You do see some Alpine Moons out of these Lurus decks, and that is a concern. That being said, you do have Blast Zone in your deck, and so you can clean up both the Alpine Moon itself and also, a board of Ragavan or DRC at the same time. Additionally, Alpine Moon can even act as fixing sometimes to let you cast Ancient Stirrings and Sylvan Scrying 2-fetch a Blast Zone. So that card is probably the most beatable form of actual Tron hate that you see in the format. And then, one thing that occurred to me as I was playing the Elementals deck this weekend was, I don't want to see an Urza's Tower, right? That seems like an absolute nightmare for me. So it may be that Tron is in that similar position to Boggles, where time has passed it by, time has not been kind to it, but if you choose the right weekend, then you can maybe not win a tournament, you get second place in a tournament, but you see where I'm going with this.
Yeah, I think this might just be a reaction to the 4-color surge, and those decks have specific weaknesses. Like, I don't think any of those decks want to play against Tron. And I'll also note that you mentioned Alpine Moon. And I think that there's a very interesting negative correlation between Urza's Tower and Urza's Saga, where the more Urza's Sagas you see, the more Alpine Moons you see, and therefore the less you want to be playing with Urza's Tower.
That is, I guess, a very flavorful point to consider there. Yeah. It is nice that the non-basic land hate you see is mostly in the form of Alpine Moon. It isn't stuff like Damping Sphere, which takes a little more time to remove. And the Lurrus decks lock themselves out of Blood Moon. So you only really have to worry about that from the Murktide region decks. And in the past, I think the impact of Blood Moon against Tron was always somewhat overstated, where you could beat that given enough time. These days, those decks just don't give you the time, right? The Izzet decks are beating you down with Murktide region or Ragavan and so on. And so Blood Moon actually is lights out the vast majority of the time. So that matchup I could see still being a little bit shaky. The one thing that is a big concern from MH2 actually is Prismatic Ending, which doesn't strike you on the face of it as a anti-Tron card, right? Like you're not casting Ending on a Wurmcoil Engine anytime soon. But so many of your good draws, if you have natural Tron into a good payoff, then good for you. You're probably winning that game. But so many of your keepable draws, like the range of draws that make this deck consistent enough to work in the first place, involve, turn 1 Expedition Map into turn 2 Crack It to find that third Tron piece, or turn 1 Chromatic Star, turn 2 Crack It for green to get the mana for the Sylvan Scrying that gets you the third piece. And when your maps and your stars are no longer safe in quite the same way, there will be a lot of games where you have to just cast that card on the first turn and cross your fingers, because if they do have the ending, your draw is just non-functional now.
Yeah, I would not hesitate to fire off Prismatic Ending on any of the artifacts turn 1 if given the chance. It's not going to do anything otherwise.
Yeah, and that's why I think the other 4 color decks, the creativity decks and the Bring to Light decks, which tend to have 4 main deck Prismatic Endings, on top of a different strategic goal by and large. I think those decks actually are still pretty good against Tron, but specifically Elementals is really going to struggle to beat the Tron deck in a fair fight.
Yeah, this third place list also going to struggle to defeat Tron in a fair fight. This is
this is Mr. Kafuriet, who longtime Magic Online observers will know is part of the Wafo Tapa entourage. And if you didn't know that, you would tell as soon as you looked at this creature base, where we have, of course, the one copy of Timeless Dragon.
Yeah, I do think that this is a slightly better weekend for Teferi Hero of Dominaria than it has been in the past while. I think a lot of the issue is that you can't beat, like, the whole thing that Teferi used to do was just kind of crunch the small ball decks in card advantage, but the small ball decks are just all playing on Holy Heat, and you can't do that. It's just done. But with less of the small ball decks and more of these medium decks that you're trying to exploit with Counterspell, and these like medium 4-color decks don't have Unholy Heat, they have Prismatic Ending, and Prismatic Ending, like hitting a Teferi with Prismatic Ending is not going to work. It's like, not only do these decks not necessarily have the 5th color, but like you're like, I'm going to beat Teferi with a 5-mana sorcery is not a winning plan. And from there, you can actually see like, oh, maybe I do actually want to cast Teferi, the big one, this week.
Yeah, it is quite nice as well that with this move from the Esper colors to the Jeskai colors, you do get a Triumph that your Timeless Dragon can find. So showing up that mana base even further there. But we will be back with the rest of this challenge and some non-Timeless Dragon related topics after a short break.
The SCG Tour Online is back. Starting Friday, July 23rd, you can play the best events in competitive Magic for thousands of dollars in cash prizes, piles of MTG Arena gems, MTG Arena qualifier invitations to skip that mythic grind, and at the very top, invitations to the MTG Arena Championships and the StarCityGames.com Invitational returning to Roanoke, Virginia from October 29th to October 31st. You heard that right. The SCG Invitational is also back. And you know the best place to qualify for it? That's right, the SCG Tour Online. Check out StarCityGames.com/SCG Tour Online to register for events, see upcoming event schedules, and get all the details on how you can earn prizes and invitations playing the SCG Tour Online.
All right, let's finish out this Sunday challenge here. And there are a few individual decks worth getting to, but also some larger trends that are worth mentioning, where we've seen these decks in the past, but what's new about this is we're seeing them again. And the deck that really falls into that category for me is Burn, which we saw in the top 8 of the showcase actually on Saturday, but also scattered throughout the top 16, top 32 of both events on the weekend here.
Yeah, it's looked like it's, again, one of these same decks in the vein of Tron and Hexproof, where you're trying to kill your opponent in a, oblique way. And the thing I've noticed about these burn lists is they've really started integrating really unique hate cards in the main deck. I don't know exactly what has prompted that, but it might just be the kind of thing where if you have Deflecting Palm against Colossus Hammer, that's great. And like Roiling Vortex might just be a good card.
Roiling Vortex against Elementals it sounds like a good time to me.
I mean, they can just start paying mana, but they probably die if they do that.
That's the thing. It's decks can usually get around Roiling Vortex in a few turns, and Burn is a very good deck at not giving them those turns to work with. And especially when their main plan is, like, they're not racing you most of the time, right? They're trying to kind of get to a state where the game isn't winnable because, they play a land and they're gaining 4 life with their Omnath, and you just can't outpace that. Vortex just invalidates that plan, basically single-handedly, and forces them to turn into this very scrappy beatdown deck to stand a chance. So that sounds like a very heads-up call on that end. And Vortex, there's just a bunch of random stuff that it hits that you don't think about, because why would you? So, like, Mistress Bauble or Bring to Light, or just random stuff where most decks have something which you really are not happy casting in the face of a Roiling Vortex.
Yeah, and the thing about Omnath, too, is, like, these aren't the growth spiral, like, Omnath, Uro kind of things we saw last year. Like, the Omnath is a turn behind, or, like, taking fetch shocks. It's not like a clean Omnath where you're, like, starting from 20 to resolve it and all this stuff. You are really exposing yourself for a fast Omnath, or it's just going to be a slow one. So it's not as big of an issue as it used to be.
Yeah, I know in the past you have put your money where your mouth is in terms of keeping track and, like, finding the one weekend where no one's respecting Burn, and suddenly Burn becomes, like, the best deck to be playing for that weekend.
Yeah, I have some questions about that right now, given I think Eidolon of the Great Revel has aged poorly, but the rest of the cards seem great right now.
I wonder is there some build where maybe it looks like more of a Prowess style deck, or maybe you play, like, the good MH2 1-drops, and so joining Goblin Guide and Swiftspear are DRC and Goblin Guide for the first time, or DRC and Ragavan, excuse me. Like, is there a way you can put the chocolate with the peanut butter there?
I don't think you want Ragavan, but I could see Channeler being really good.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of mono red decks, if we hop back to the Saturday challenge for the moment, we have our old favorite Obosh Red in 15th place here in the hands of Magic Dan. And it's easy to just make fun of this deck as a concept and some of the stranger lands that have appeared in these builds over time. But this deck is just all good cards at this point, and it feels like just very fundamentally solid, which is not something I would have said even a few months ago.
Yeah, I think a lot of this deck's favor is tied into Fury and Blood Moon, and I don't know if it's the best Fury deck right now. But the cards are certainly powerful.
Is a Void Mirror in that category too, where if Roiling Vortex is free rolling off a lot of these free spells in the Elemental decks and so on, then Void Mirror can do some work there, or if you have the foresight to recognize that there's going to be a Tron Mirror in the finals of one of these challenges, then maybe Magic Dan was calling that shot here with these Void Mirrors. But I don't know. I'm more impressed in this deck than I ever have been or ever expected to be. So just noting that for the record here. In the mana base, we still have the 3 Blast Zones chilling out, and I guess that's the way you beat Boggles as well with this deck. But 3 copies of Den of the Bugbear. So I tentatively brought this up during the AFR preview season as we're scrabbling around for modern playables, maybe this finds its way into the Obosh Red deck, and it seems like it has full now, but I don't know if that's just going to be a temporary thing.
No, it's probably good enough. I mean, a lot of your lands round to basic mountains, so anything that like rounds to a basic mountain plus when you don't have a Blood Moon is probably good.
Somehow, Bonecrusher Giant not even good enough to make this main deck anymore. And if you look at the roster of cheap red spells that can interact with creatures, we have 3 Firebolt, 4 Flame Slash, 4 Lightning Bolt, 3 Unholy Heat, 3 Seal Fire, and 4 Spitefield Hazard. So your X1s are not safe, people, against this deck. If you get paired against anyone who reveals Obosh, then it's your creatures are not long for this world.
Yeah, I just realized there's a piece of tech that I wanted to bring up that is just above this in the standings in the 14th place. Is it list? There's sideboard magnetic theft.
So you may have to give the Oracle text on that one for the listeners at home.
Yeah, it's just red, attach target equipment to target creature. So they make a hammer, and then you pick up the hammer, and then your opponent gets hammered.
Oh, the best part of this card, by the way, is the reminder text in bracket saying control of the equipment doesn't change, which I actually think is more misleading than illuminating, because you are still equipping the equipment to your creature and getting the full impact of that. So your Ragavan can pick up a Colossus Hammer and get to work here, even if they are technically still the one controlling the hammer.
They can pay 10 if they want, or 8, however much it is. They can pay the full retail price and move it over.
Crucially, they can re-equip with Pure Steel Paladin,
Yes.
but hey, if you're clocking them for 10 or 12, with Ragavan, then maybe they don't have a turn to get to do that.
Very possible. Anything else diving deep into these lists that stands out? I know there's one deck on Sunday that's probably worth bringing up, and that's the Lotus Field deck. This is the sort of, I guess it used to be Twiddle Storm, but now it's Twiddle Breach. Recently brought back by Jacob Nagro and a few other people, toying with the idea of Wish. But this list, it looks like, is playing Inquisition of Kozilek. I don't remember if Bryant Cook ended up on that card. And this is like a pretty traditional Underworld Breach loop deck where you end up with a Tome Scour and then start you Tome Scour yourself and then you twiddle your Lotus Field, the whole thing. Your deck's in your graveyard and then you kill them.
Yeah, and this is the spell combo deck that we identified the format as really lacking right now in our episode on the disappearance of combo a few weeks ago. So a few other things to touch on. We have one deck which we may be storing here for our Nonsense of the Week that managed to crack into the top 8. So always nice when those two things dovetail together. We have Xenowan, I believe, in 11th place here with a Orzhov Reanimator deck featuring a Stoneforge Mystic Transformational package in the sideboard. And this is courtesy of Kellen Pastor again. So nice to see that deck on the map. I think that Kellen himself has said that maybe this is not the right time for that deck, really, but he's going to stick with it anyway because he has a lot of fun with it. But something to keep in the back pocket maybe for if you realize that all of the main deck surgical extractions and so on have disappeared.
Yeah, I do like this deck's positioning a little better than like 2 weeks into the format when people were still playing a ton of Relic of Progenitus. So it is getting better for it. And I do like just having a million Archons. And Sarah's Emissary has been a very powerful card. I think that card's a little bit underrated as a finisher, though Archon's also just really insane. So there's a lot of good stuff here.
Yeah, Sarah's Emissary lights out against Hammer in particular in game 1. They can just not remove that card. And honestly, usually in post-board games as well. That thing is going to stick around and force them to find, I guess, one of the 2 copies of Path of Exile that may not even be in their 75 in the first place. And one nice thing about this kind of hybrid package here, where you have Grief and Ephemerate and so on, is sometimes you get your big thing into play, whether it's Emissary or Archon of Cruelty in particular, and you just get to save it from removal with Ephemerate, and that's all you need to slam the door shut. Moving down to 12th place here, we have more adventures in Asmo decks. So this is Jeskai Asmo, where we're stretching the mana base here in our Saga deck for Expressive Iteration, Teferi Time Raveler, Prismatic Ending. We got some Wear Tears in the sideboard too. And alongside just the usual suspects from these Asmo decks. So maybe a shell worth looking at if you're wanting to stick with that. So I did see during the week Spider Space, who top 8'd a previous challenge with the Rakdos Asmo deck, and always a good person to follow if you're looking for some innovative takes on things. They were streaming an Azorius Asmo deck, which you might think, hold on a second, how is this color combination casting Asmo? And it turns out that off the top of your head, what are the creature types on Asmo, Ari?
Human. I don't know what the other one is.
It's a human wizard, and yeah, the human part is kind of a freebie because if you've ever played Yawgmoth with or against this deck, then, that part became apparent pretty quick. But it's a human wizard, and so this deck was playing the 4/4 Cavern of Souls as one part of this light splash for Asmo in a deck that also had stuff like Urza, which is a human, and just a bunch of other like humans and wizards where I don't know if the mana would work without Cavern of Souls, but with Cavern of Souls, you get to cast all of these cards and also cast them through counter magic. So that was an interesting twist to see.
Yeah, that I would not have expected that splash off of those exact cards. That is, I can only imagine the first time that happens to you in a game and just like, what? Wait, what?
I guess once you see the Cookbook and the Daredevil, then the jig is up in some capacity. But in any case, the one final thing here from these weekend results was in 22nd place, and this is actually the highest that this archetype has finished in quite some time. This is the Domain Zoo deck featuring Sign of Draco and Territorial Kavu, the deck which I think most of us expected during the spoiler season would make its mark in some capacity. And when you have all 5 colors to work with, you have so many options, you don't know what that deck's going to look like, but it seemed like on paper, some build of that is going to be good, right? And I think of all of the decks that looked promising during that preview season, this is the one that has most failed to really perform in any way.
I was always a seller on this archetype.
I know.
I did not believe that these rates were what you like. It was really hard to look at this deck and then look at Death Shadow and be like, yes, this is what I want to be doing. I want to like do all this work and fetch all these pain lands to make a 4/4 for 2. It's like if I did that, I just have a 7/7 for 1.
It is especially hard to get excited about that on a weekend where Solitude and Fury are really making a name for themselves. But I don't know. It seems like just on paper, given where the format is going, being a deck with, cheap threats, cheap interaction, and also because you have a bunch of gold cards, you get to play a bunch of pitch spells like Force of Vigor and stuff if you want to. That's a fine recipe against, Hammer Time and stuff like that. And then against the grindy decks, then you get to play some Cascade spells or some sticky multicolor threats. It seems like there should be a recipe in there somewhere, but it just doesn't really come together.
I've mentioned playing this match before, but I did play against an opponent who had a lot of these cards with Song of Creation. And there might be something to like the Cascade spells and that, and maybe some like Flashback or Escape, and closing out the burn. I don't quite know exactly how to put it together, but that feels like it's doing something more than just like playing idiots.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so as we mentioned, there's one more deck here that we will be saving for our nonsense of the week, and we will get into the successful decks of the week after another short break here. Don't go anywhere. Alright folks, we're taking a brief time out here to talk about SCG Premium, and for the low price of just $7.99 a month, which is less than the cost of one collector booster, by the way, here's what you get. 5% off sealed product, 10% off singles, 15% off supplies, and that's everything from sleeves, deck boxes, to binders, and so much more. If you're making a big order to get ready for Paper Magic again, that month of premium just paid for itself. On top of that, you get more content and better content than anywhere else at the best prices. If you're here now with me and Ari and you like what you hear, you can get our weekly columns, but that's only the start. How about the literal world champion, and for my money, the best player of all time, Paolo Vido Damagerosa? How about Pro Tour champions and Mythic champions from Jerry Thompson to Autumn Buchette? We have the best standard player of all time, perhaps, in Brad Nelson, and the best limited mind in the game right now in Sam Black, and so much more. And if one piece of advice from any of us helps you win just one more round in a tournament, well, that month of premium just paid for itself many times over. Get the best discounts and the best content over at starcitygames.com/join-premium. All right, so let's get into our main topic here, and this is the other 4 color decks, which were mostly overshadowed by the success of Elementals. But if you've been paying attention to these trends in the format over the past few weeks, we have the Creativity decks and the Bring to Light Scapeshift decks, both putting out good performances, and both doing that yet again. I don't think this should be a surprise after the past few weeks.
No, they're just good cards. Just really great cards. And I think that we're even still seeing these decks getting better. Notably, like the Creativity decks, finding the Emrakul option has been really huge. And that's what got second in the Showcase Challenge.
Yeah, you even see the Velomachus decks moving in that direction as well, where some of them have this split of one Velomachus and one Emrakul, which makes some sense in terms of in a longer game, let's say you expect they have maybe one copy of Solitude, for example. If you can present several creativity targets and then that turns into several creativity payoffs, you can get through that one piece of interaction that might stymie you otherwise. That being said, if you're casting your turn 4 creativity to race a linear deck or something, and you can't even be sure you're going to hit the Velomachus, at that point, what is the Velomachus really doing for you, other than making you clunk up your deck with Save of the Moments and Time Warps?
I think that there's some idea where it's like a semi-acceptable version of Xenagos, where like you can, if you like, you're basically in the spot where either target on creativity for 1 is good, but if you creativity for 2, you're very likely to instantly win the game. Whereas if you, I've had issues with just the Velomachus not properly chaining off, even if you hit the first time. And it's not like the historic deck where you have like things that actually give you significant value over a single extra turn. Like you actually need to hit all the extra turns in order to kill them. So maybe that's the goal, but I don't know.
Yeah, it's I have been a lot more impressed with the solo Emrakul build here, and maybe you can weave in another secondary target into those builds too, where in those longer games you get to creativity for 2, you find Emrakul, you find something else, whatever that would be, fill in the blank if you can, and that's how you beat, let's say, Teferi bouncing your payoff creature, which is a big issue for these decks, honestly. And as much as these decks are good because they get to be good Teferi decks, and especially, I think this one in particular is the best Teferi deck because you can play your creativity on their end step, and so you're not giving them any window at all to interact with the creativity itself or the thing that it's finding. Teferi is also very good against these decks and effectively shuts them down while it's in play. And honestly, that goes to some extent for Elementals and Bring to Light as well. So if I was playing one of those decks, it's because I get to play Teferi, and if I'm playing, Wafo Tapper, Esper, or Jeskai with a Timeless Dragon, maybe I'll keep the Timeless Dragon around, but I will find something else to cut for some more copies of Teferi.
Yeah, Teferi is just really great in these decks, though there is kind of this weird issue that it creates, specifically in this creativity deck with Dwarven Mine. I had a lot of games come up with Dwarven Mine where you're effectively like playing third. There's this issue where like, because of Dwarven Mine, you have so many red sources and you don't even have the option in a lot of these lists of finding like a breeding pool or a temple garden. And you have this issue where like you want to play a turn 2 Wrenn and Six, but your hand is like fetch Dwarven Mine. And then if you get a green source, there's not like, you have to go like turn 1 Dwarven Mine, turn 2 fetch a green source, pick up the fetch. And then from there, there's just not a land you can fetch to cast a fairy because the green source you're fetching is what, the stomping ground you have? I think there might need to be a little bit more thought put into that. And then even then, there's still this whole issue with like, you just drew a Dwarven Mine and it's tapped. And that's like not the greatest thing in the world. So this deck doesn't really have the full support of the 4-color mana base. So like Teferi Wren's a bit of a stretch, but I mean, it's doing some good stuff.
Yeah, this issue came up for me a lot with the 4-color Omnath decks last year, which often had not just 2 Field of the Dead, which it made sense because that card was so powerful, but also 2 copies of Field of Ruin in a deck with 27, 28 total lands. And it's like, I get that in theory, Wrenn and Six gives you this continual source of fetch lands, which then parlays you into something else, but you have to actually be able to cast that card in the first place. And then we're still hoping to cast Omnath on 4, and colorless lands don't let us do that. And so with these 4-color decks, you can take some creative liberties with your mana base, but you really have to be disciplined about it. And with these creativity decks, they have a pretty low just total land count in general. You're looking at 24 lands in the stock list, and that includes 2 Triomes and 4 Dwarven Mines. And so it is actually very difficult to curve out, even if you do have the Wrenn and Six, because to get to the Wrenn and Six in the first place, you're having to zig in this direction, and then that's a lot further you have to zag back in order to cast a Teferi. So honestly, if I was picking up these decks, that is the first thing I would want to do is clean up these mana bases. And maybe that means looking critically at the 4 copies of Dwarven Mine. Like, is the 4th one a Sacred Cow? Are you fetching all 4 copies often enough to make that worth it? Questions like that, I think, have to be answered if we're going to try this.
Yeah, I know playing this deck, I was actually sideboarding. There's a sideboard Plains in the list that got second place. And I was just boarding in the Plains to have a like untapped fetchable land at times. So I I think that you may just want more lands just to fill out your fetch targets.
And that's another downside too, is so often you do want to fetch a basic, whether it's to insulate yourself against Blood Moon or to cast a Prismatic Ending on turn 1 without taking a boatload of damage, which, sometimes if you're casting the ending on a 1-drop, it's because you're under pressure and you need to alleviate that pressure, and taking the additional damage is going to be a big deal there. And so having to delay your own development in order to buy time in this self-defeating way, that is a problem that you have to work through somehow.
Yeah, you did say the word delay, so I'd just like to shout out delay being awesome in this deck. You are a true Teferi deck, and delay plus Teferi felt really powerful.
Yeah, that is one of the draws to this deck for sure. And I don't know if you can transplant that into other shells. I think it works here because even if you don't have the Teferi, if you're just casting delay naturally, you can often win the game within that 2 or 3 turn window before the spell would come off suspend. Whereas in, let's say, the Wafo Tapper style control decks, that's almost never the case. And so delay is a very specific tool for a deck that's trying to be otherwise proactive for the most part.
Yeah, and also very specific to this deck, they can't ever make double blue, right? That's the real issue. You can't play counterspell. So you've still got to approximate it, whereas Wafo can just play 4.
Yeah, and Remand is not a great card when most of the time it's trading down on mana, right? Like, Remand is the best card you could ask for when it's time walking against your opponent's 4-drop. Not so great when you Remand their Ragavan and they just recast it again, right? So I don't know if that card, maybe it's better now in a world of 4-color mirrors and 2 different types of Tron deck meeting in the finals of a challenge, but for the most part, I think that's another card which, as the format gets more lean and more efficient, just gets squeezed out from it.
Yeah, I have not been a huge fan of that. I have been a huge fan of Sarah's Emissary out of the sideboard here. This was the spot that I had actually cast, or not cast, but put a Sarah's Emissary on the battlefield. And that, again, we talked about this, but it is a really good alternate target to the Emrakul. The weird part is that if you put Sarah's Emissary in your deck, I think you are kind of legally obligated to board in the plains so that you have enough white sources to cast it if you accidentally draw it. Because unlike Emrakul, you can't do the thing where you Prismari Command, discard it, and shuffle back in, because it doesn't do that.
This actually came up in a very tragic match I played at 5-0 in the Modern Showcase against this second place creativity deck, where eventually timed out in a spot where I think I was probably favored, but that's entirely my own fault, where in game 3, they had creativitied into Emrakul and Sarah's Emissary, and I was able to ferry the Emissary that was on creature to unlock my Solitude on the Emrakul, but then I was basically dead if they were able to recast the Emissary, but they weren't. And so even though they had Wrenn and Six going, endless supply of fetch lands, they had their Ralgrim Triome and their Sacred Foundry, but just weren't able to recast the Emissary. And so I was in a game which, if there was a third white source in their deck, I probably would have been completely locked out of.
Yep. So just don't let that happen to you.
Yes. And don't let yourself time out at a spot where you're, in a great position in the tournament. But, we all have regrets in our lives. Anyway, before moving on to the Scapeshift deck, have you got a chance to play the Elemental's Mirror yet? Because if you haven't, this is one of the most mind-melting, bizarre forms of Magic I've ever had a chance to play.
I have not participated in that event.
That quintessential experience. So it's almost like playing 4-dimensional Uno is the best way I can think of describing it, where no one does anything until all of a sudden everyone does everything at the same time. But there are weird ways where, because you're playing a mirror, your cards line up oddly against each other. So, for example, this is a matchup, because it's a matchup in Modern, where Teferi is really good, because it stops them from ephemerating their stuff in response to your removal, and it stops their ephemerate from rebounding. And so having Teferi control, if you like, is a crucial factor you want to work towards. And so Teferi naturally puts itself up to 5 loyalty, which puts it out of range of Fury, because if Teferi is on 4 or less loyalty, what they can do is evoke the Fury and then put the evoke trigger on the bottom of the stack have Fury deal the damage, and once Teferi dies, they can then ephemerate it to deal with your other stuff. And so that is a crucial loyalty breakpoint, if you like. However, because 5 is pretty close to 4, you end up in this spot where, like, Flamekin Harbinger being able to attack for 1 suddenly is a really big deal, or Wrenn and Six being able to downtick and shoot Teferi for 1, unlocking the Fury, which then unlocks everything else, that can suddenly cascade out of control. And so, both Planeswalkers end up being more important than even they would appear at first glance. And then, because all of the spells are free, like your Solitude and your Fury and Ephemerate cost 1 mana and so on, like, no one's casting any spells for the first few turns, and then once either player plays a Risen Reef, it just all kicks off. Like, everyone is just casting spells in this rapid flurry. And you have to work with this weird imperfect information because you can't glean from the fact that they haven't done anything that their hand must have certain cards in it, because that's just how the deck plays. It doesn't do anything until it does everything. And so it's like, well, you take this line, which maybe is good against exactly 1 pitch creature plus Ephemerate, but if they have 2, then it blows you out, except not really, because then they have no cards left, and if you draw, your 8 outs, your Solitude or your Fury, then you just get to, like, re-trump them at the same time. And because, like, all the decks are full of Mold Drifters and Flametongue Karvus, and if you have Risen Reef, the Flametongue Karvus are also Mold Drifters, and so it's just, it goes off the chains. And the cute part is, because all the creatures are the same size, because they're the same creatures, Kahira actually lets you take this really aggressive shift if you have to, where you just pick up Kahira, play Kahira, attack, and now they have no good blocks, and your creatures have vigilance, so they can't attack back into yours unless they play their own Kahira, at which point, so it's just, it's a hot mess. And having to figure this out against Canister on his stream for the first time as I was playing this was it was a real trip, let me tell you.
Oh my god, that does not... So, question, when you Flamekin Harbinger in this matchup, what do you find?
That's the thing, right? Because you're preparing for this future fight where you don't know what weapons either player is showing up with just yet. So I think often Fury is a thing you want to get, where, like, 1 trigger from Fury can kill several things, and Fury is the best attacker. And so Fury advantage, if you want to simplify it down to that, is what it often comes down to. But as we mentioned, there's a bottleneck in terms of red cards to pitch to Fury, and Flamekin Harbinger is the most expendable of those. And then the body on Harbinger doesn't really get you anywhere either. So you kind of want to save that when you have a Risen Reef to go with it, but that's not a luxury that you have a lot of the time. So even the question of how do you play with that card is pretty complicated too.
I like how the answer might just be you don't. Like, it's like, what do you find? Don't. Just don't.
Yeah, honestly.
Oh my gosh.
It's bizarre.
Is there a, like, is there something you can sideboard to kind of get out of this? Like, is there... I guess that doesn't even make it better, but...
This was the natural question when I was discussing with Namasquats, who top-aided this challenge, and a few other people, of, okay, well, we're all playing elementals, and other people probably are as well. What do we sideboard for the mirror? Is there some elemental we can search for that breaks this open? The closest thing that we could find was Fulminator Mage, which, because both decks are so mana hungry, especially the version with Utopia Sprawl, sometimes you're on the play, you play a Fulminator, you tag their land, that can set them behind so much to the point where they can't come back anymore. But then that's just kind of embarrassing in the face of Wrenn and Six, among other things. So I don't think there's a clean answer there. And the go-to solutions for other decks, like Torpor Orb and Harbinger and so on, even in this era of asymmetrical hate pieces, all of those, every version of that effect is symmetrical. So there's no way to just swing that in your favor either.
Yeah, I was gonna ask if Hushbringer's even an elemental, but it doesn't even sound like that matters.
No, so I guess moving on to more pleasant topics to think about, let's touch on this final 4-color deck here in Bring to Light Scapeshift. And is the 1 copy of Valky/Tibble enough to qualify this as 4.5 colors, or are we not even going there?
Did that Lightning Skelemental qualify that deck as 4.5 colors? I actually cast the Valky a lot for what it's worth. I think that it is it's like a underrated interactive card. I don't think I would just play it unless I could have the Tibalt side reliably, but like drawing it is not something I'm super sad about.
Yeah, and you have the Savai Triome in most lists, or Meltine, who has had consistent success with this deck even before MH2. I think likes to have either an Overgrown Tomb or a Watery Grave, to support an Unmoored Ego in the sideboard, among other things. So you can stretch into the full 5 colors here without too much effort. But this is a deck which I was planning to play on the weekend before switching to Elementals, and I think having seen the success of Elementals, I think Bring to Light is a natural exploit for that. So my next level pick is my original pick, and so I'm kind of kicking myself, even though I played the deck which had a very successful weekend ultimately.
Yeah, I do want to point out, like, one of the things, like I said, I harped on the Dwarven Mind thing. This deck doesn't really have the same issue, and I think it just has to do with like Valakut not being a naturally important part of the deck in the way Dwarven Mind is like a critical aspect of the Indomitable Creativity deck. Where like, if I play a Valakut, I don't care if I find mountains. Like, I'm not naturally going to Valakut someone unless I have Dryad and all of my lands are mountains.
Yeah, if anything with this deck, it's the opposite. Is because you are priced into playing these lands that only tap for red mana, you want to be using your fetch lands to find the basic forest, the basic plains, the basic island to get that broad spread across the rainbow without having to take too much pain or having too many other lands that come in tapped. And you do have a lot of those. You have a bunch of Triomes, and I think you need the Triomes to make up the numbers for your Scapeshift with the Valakuts, but you just have a higher land count, and so you can afford to play third, if you like, in some scenarios, because you have enough untapped lands to make up the difference there.
Yeah, and also, like, you want to leave those mountains in your deck for Valakut. Like, not even talking about, like, having having painless lands. Like, the mountains are better off in your library for the Scapeshift kill off.
Yeah, and you do, when you're building this mana base, you do wonder, can you get away with cutting that 10th mountain? How many do you actually need? And I'm not sure what the answer to that question is myself, if you have any thoughts there.
The last time I remember thinking about this question, someone else answered with playing a 66-card deck. So I'm going to leave this one to the experts and just keep on going with what it is.
Honestly, how absurd is it to play 61 here in your deck, which there's no one specific card that's too important, but having exactly that 10th mountain, you can be a difference maker in some scenarios.
I could easily see that being fine. Though I do think I would trim on like the fire ices before I started going down that road.
Yeah, like it feels like the deck wants 28.x lands or thereabouts, roughly, depending on how many cantrips you have. Do you play 3 or 4 copies of Wrenn and Six and so on? But something around that ballpark feels right to me. And so, yeah, maybe that's how you square that circle, so to speak. But I don't know how much more there is to say about this deck. We've gone over the basic concept before, and I think it's fairly self-explanatory. And also, we've seen it in action so many times that you get an idea just from playing with or against the deck. But I guess the flex slots, in as far as they exist in the main deck, are worth touching on. So main deck Chalice of the Void was, for me, one of the main draws to playing this deck just a few short weeks ago. And it feels like that card has got markedly worse, where, the card can do some things against elementals in terms of shutting off Ephemerate and so on, but it's not like a fantastic card there. Very hit or miss against the hammer decks, and even the lowest decks now, many of them either have main deck Prismatic Ending, or a bunch of Colligan's commands, or they just have a slightly higher curve. In the case of these Grixis decks, where, all right, you've locked out their 1-drops, they've probably cast one of those already, and now they're going to beat you straight up with their iterations and Drown of the Locks and Snapcaster Mages and so on. So they don't really need their ones at that point. So I feel like, Chalice is still a phenomenal sideboard card, especially for the Cascade decks. But for me, I'm not playing this deck so that I get to main deck Chalice anymore. I think the format has already moved past that.
Agree. I think this is a better... I mean, all of these 4-color decks are good decks to utilize Chalice in, but I don't think this deck needs the Chalice unless we start looping back to the Living End or Crashing Footfalls days.
Mm-hmm. One card that I had some questions about is Expressive Iteration. And usually you see this in decks with much lower curves, but the lesson I've found, especially in other formats, is even in decks that are going higher up, where the card is a little bit more clunky, it still just is very good most of the time. And especially here in this deck that really wants to make all of its land drops, and in particular, in the games where you have Dryad and you're looking to not just have land drops to make full use of it, but you're looking to find Valakut and to find fetch lands, Iteration and Dryad pair very well together in those games, in my experience.
Is it better than Growth Spiral if that's the main purpose of it?
You already see these decks shaving down on Explore a bit in some cases, going down to 3 instead of 4. And I think Explore is much better than Growth Spiral in this deck, where you have a bunch of mountains that come into play tapped, and the difference between getting to play an extra land and pulling a land into play from your hand, it might seem like a semantic difference, but that actually does come up in gameplay a fair bit. And so I think I would play the 4th Explore before going back to Growth Spiral as additional copies, but I guess I don't see those cards as being in competition so much as like Iteration versus the Fire Rises that I put in there just to make up the numbers, for example.
That's fair. I guess also like the instant part of Growth Spiral is just not coming up with this deck ever. There just aren't instants in it.
And Explore with Iteration is, for the same reason that Dryad is good with that kind of effect. I think those cards synergize nicely as well. So I had some Iterations in my sideboard a few weeks ago on the basis that in most matchups I was bringing in more cheap interaction anyway, like Dispute or Veil or Lightning Bolts, whatever it is. And so my Iterations would be better for that reason. And also in general, just sideboarded games of Magic are longer, you exchange resources more, and so Iteration is just a better card in post-board games on the whole, I would argue. And then in the matchups where I really want a Chalice on 0, Iteration is like a Anticipate plus for my Chalices if it comes down to that.
That all checks out. There's a different, so we're talking about, these kind of 2-drops and Chalice. I'm looking at this Lavinia in the Sunday challenge. There's a list that's floating around in the 20s, 24th place. There's a Lavinia Azorius Renegade in the sideboard, and that seems like a card that really should be in these decks. So Lavinia is notably a one-sided hate card along the lines of Roiling Vortex. So it's blue-white 2/2, fairly recent. So I guess you might know what it does, but you probably don't actually know what it does. It's one of these cards. Each opponent can't cast non-creature spells with converted mana cost greater than the number of lands they control, and whenever an opponent casts a spell that didn't have mana spent on it, it gets countered. But like it being a creature and not an artifact for Bring to Light is pretty relevant. So pretty big fan of being able to fetch like a new class of hate card with Bring to Light.
Yeah, nice card to have against. I guess, how does Lavinia work against Cavern of Souls out of Elemental? That's not good for the Lavinia side, right?
Well, Lavinia is non-creature to begin with, so you're
oh, okay.
Or wait, no, it casts a spell if no man. Sorry, the first ability is non-creature. I literally just read the card, and I don't know. Okay,
so in
works
theory,
well.
Reading the card explains the card, but not so much in practice, as it turns out.
Well, it's really hard to pay no mana for a spell if you paid for it with Cavern of Souls, so we can cross off that interaction right there.
Oh, so I turn that back on me. Reading the card very much does not explain the card. Okay.
Oh my gosh. Anyways, there's a reason I read this card in the first place.
Reading is good, folks. Anyway, so that seems like a wise move in the same vein as these void mirrors that have been popping up, or so on. The Roiling Vortexes. That broad class of hate cards is in a good spot right now.
Yeah. Do you think this deck, on the subject of hate cards, should be doing anything to get better against Blood Moon, or is it good enough as is?
I would like to think between Dryad fixing your mana just to cast most of your spells, Prismatic Ending for 3, given that you've built your deck in such a way that you don't have to burn your endings on other cheap threats, I think that's a crucial thing. So against the Regent decks, for example, this is part of why I like Fire Ice, where, getting to use that to kill a Ragavan or a Channeler means I get to save my more versatile removal spell for, either another one of those cards or a Blood Moon that might be coming down the pipeline there. So on top of that, you also have Teferi, which one of the many good things Teferi does is both proactive and reactive insurance against Blood Moon, and then Bring to Light for Valky, or Tybalt rather, if you're able to fetch Forest and Island, or if you cast a Dryad post Blood Moon, which is what you need to do for Dryad to fix your mana there, and then you get to cast Bring to Light. I think between all of those, and like sometimes you hardcast Mystical Dispute against the Region decks on their Blood Moons too, between all of that, I think you're okay for the most part, but it is still a problem. And in terms of like games which you thought you were going to win and then you suddenly end up losing, Blood Moon is still a big part of that.
Okay, yeah. And like, you know, after seeing Elementals just bake in that inherent Harbinger for Foundation Breaker plan, it just feels like these other decks might want to be doing more.
For sure. And against stuff like the Gruul land destruction decks where you can afford to board in Force of Vigor, then that gives you an extra layer of coverage. I don't think you can really do that against the Region decks where that's your only target, because just getting stranded with that dead card does matter a lot. But the decks where you can hit Blood Moon or a bunch of their other cards, then those are almost easier Blood Moon decks to beat, even though they're better at casting it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the best Blood Moon deck is the Is It deck, and you may as well be trying to fight against their normal stuff, and then if they Blood Moon you, they Blood Moon you. Like, it's really hard to like dedicate work towards Blood Moon when you're also losing to Murktide Regent.
Right. I will say, in terms of the Force of Vigors in the Bring to Light sideboard, I do like those a lot, specifically against Hammer, where there's a bunch of cards you can bring to the table in that matchup, but a lot of them are a little slow, a little inefficient, and I find the games that you lose to Hammer most often are where you just get overpowered, especially if you're on the draw, and having this free spell which can nuke two things, buy you some time, like that's what you want more so than like Wear Tear, for example, there.
Yeah, if the first copy for sure you have to play, right? Because you can find it with Bring to Light, and then every copy after that is a reasonable choice.
Yeah, I think that makes sense to me. So that covers each of these decks individually. In terms of their place in the format or how they line up specifically against each other, where do you come down on that?
I think that it's very hard to justify saying that the Indomitable Creativity deck is good against Elementals just because of the bad lineup against Solitude. So that's like a pretty clean negative there. It may... How much have you played the Creativity versus Scapeshift matchup?
Not very much. I get the impression that Creativity is probably ahead there, but I honestly don't know. Like, it's kind of hard for that deck to beat just like the natural Dryad lines, I find. And maybe it's just like whoever gets to stick the first to Fairy, which is a good case for, you know, playing 4 in the 75, perhaps, if these 4 color mirrors are going to be a big thing.
Well, I'll also make the statement that the Dryad thing, the like Dryad Valakut thing, is a lot less relevant because of Hard Evidence and Emrakul. Like, that specific setup means that you have an artifact that you can Creativity into Emrakul, which from there is just like, you know, a clean lock. And I don't think that these Scapeshift decks can sort of, I guess they can Verdict in Emrakul, but I think at that point, like if you have a Dryad, like this whole setup we're describing, like if you could Verdict in Emrakul, you could just kill your opponent with Scapeshift. I'm inclined to think the deck with remands and delays is probably ahead in the matchup.
That would make sense to me. Yeah, like in terms of both decks getting to just do their thing straight up, Bring to Light gets to like re-trump and onboard Emrakul with either Bring to Light for Supreme Verdict, or I guess Bring to Light for Tybalt, I suppose, if you want to go that way, or just Bring to Light for Scapeshift, right? If given enough time. But that deck, because it has to have a bunch of Bring to Light targets and just a much higher land count, you don't have as much interaction like Remand or Delay and so on. Fewer copies of Teferi in the main deck for the most part. So yeah, I think Creativity is probably ahead there, but do you think that's fixable from the Bring to Light side?
I think you can make it better, but I think it comes at a significant cost because like the way I don't think the Bring to Light deck is as good of a remand deck as the Creativity deck is on a lot of levels. it's just like a much slower combo deck. You're doing a lot less with the time that you're buying off of these remands, and like it's really, I think it is it's an uphill battle. But then from there, we talked about, okay, so if elementals beats creativity and creativity beats Scapeshift, well, Scapeshift beats elementals, right?
Yes, you do have this rock, paper, scissors kind of setup there. And that's why, as I said, going into the weekend, I dreaded facing the Bring to Light decks with elementals. And I was planning to play Bring to Light, and I think I should have played Bring to Light because of this sudden upswing in elementals. And I think of the 3 decks, Bring to Light is the least exploitable of the 3 in terms of like, yeah, you're going to see a bunch more torp robs this week. And so it's going to be harder to win with elementals or with creativity. Like stuff that removes permanence can still be good against creativity. And that deck is more all in on creativity. It doesn't really have as good of a backup plan. Whereas Bring to Light, you are much more multifaceted. And there's no one card which is, oh God, I've got to remove that or I just can't play the game anymore.
Well, also your important permanent type is lands. Like if we're scaling things, it's like, well, small creatures are easier to kill than like cantrip creatures. And then lands are just outright impossible to kill relative to that. And like, yeah, that all makes sense that it is the hardest thing to interact with. But at the same time, it feels like it's kind of like in this weird spot of it's the very non-polarized version of the archetype. And maybe you just want to play the archetype when one of the polarized versions is the best.
Yeah, it's like elementals is both playing to the board and controlling the board a lot more. And so this is where going back to what feels like an eternity ago when we were talking about like Asmo and Yawgmoth and Unholy Heat and Solitude and all of the constraints on just like attacking with creatures in this format. Elementals is the new manifestation of that, really. But also, a lot of those cards can do good work against elementals under the right circumstances. And then creativity, it's playing to the board as a means to an end almost because, well, that's how the card creativity works. But otherwise, we want to avoid that as much as we can. And then the Bring to Light deck just doesn't really care. Like, okay, you get to remove their Planeswalker sometimes, but it's already done something on the way out. And eventually they will cast a Bring to Light for Scapeshift and the game is going to end. So in terms of minimizing your commitment to the board, Bring to Light is the most resilient from that angle. But then stuff that fights you on the stack, right? You're not a Cavern of Souls deck. You don't have as many Teferis, as many ways to like punch back with your own interaction. And so just like generic counter magic, for example, is going to be better against Bring to Light than either of these other decks.
Yeah, and well, it's not, you could play more Teferis, but one of the issues is that this is also a deck that is like, because you have a higher land count, you're cutting into your, this is kind of like, it's not like you're playing more lands because you just like don't, you're playing more lands because the combo requires more lands. We talked about this 61 card thing. That cuts into your interactive spots, and it's just a slightly less interactive deck than the other versions of this. So you are like, I mentioned elementals as like being kind of easy to go under because it doesn't do anything, but Scapeshift also kind of doesn't do anything. And one of the other draws away from Scapeshift towards Indomitable Creativity is that the creativity deck plays a bunch of 1-mana spells that interact.
Yeah, and sometimes like hard evidence is a good form of interaction against Ragavan or attackers, right? And then you have your bolts and your prismatic endings, you have some 2-mana interaction, and then once you get up to 3 for Prismari Command, often that is a thing that like catches you back up in the game, where it's killing 2 things or it's setting up your combo and delaying the game a little bit by killing something else. So yeah, that is the most interactive deck on that angle, and that's the axis where the Bring to Light deck suffers the most. Maybe this is where you come full circle to Fire Ice, right? Because Fire often is kill 1 thing, or sometimes you hit the jackpot and you get to kill 2 things. And then Ice, especially in these 4-color mirrors, that is your time walk, right? You play against elementals, you ice their second land on their turn 3, they're not casting Risen Reef anymore, right? Or against the creativity decks, you ice them on what's meant to be the Teferi turn or the creativity turn, and that can buy you a full turn to keep going while replacing itself. So maybe that's the kind of angle that you're meant to lean into a little more there.
Possibly. I'm looking at the Melton list from 18th place in the showcase, and Melton was playing Remand, so maybe you just want to go back to that kind of play. Notably, no explorers in this list.
Also, Ice, pretty damn nice against Urza's Tower as well, for the record.
Yeah, if your Scapeshift blue strategy isn't beating Urza's Tower by default, I'm questioning what's going on, but yeah, that might just not be the case anymore. Enough things may have changed.
This is a thing, right? Because back in 2012, that was the nightmare matchup for Tron, because the Scapeshift deck had this eventual inevitable kill, but it also had a bunch of Rabans and Cryptic commands, God forbid. And now the Tron deck has remained basically the same. The Scapeshift deck has got a bunch of new goodies, but those are edging out the clunky reactive cards that you had before. And so even though the Tron deck has gained so much less in that specific matchup, maybe its positioning is a lot better now.
Yeah, we're saying the things that the Scapeshift decks has gained, that they've gained interactive spells that don't interact with Urza's Tower. Prismatic Ending is the biggest gain, and even if that's good against map, it's not good against literal tower.
Yeah, it's actually good against specifically Star and Sphere in a way that no cards really were in the past. Like, you could, in theory, have Ancient Grudge, Chromatic Star all this time, right? But how far does that really get you? Whereas this is you just pick off their Star on turn one, like, they just might not literally cast a spell for the rest of the game anymore.
Yeah. I think that you might, maybe what the Scapeshift deck needs to do is, like, people have been carrying over a lot of the same principles outside of the core cards. It might be time just to re-examine everything. We were talking about, all these flex slots. It might be really time to re-examine everything beyond, like, Dryad, Wrenn and Six Bring to Light.
Are there any cards that stand out as maybe on the chopping block there?
See, that's there's not a lot of cards, and I don't know which they would be, but it may be more of a question of adding the cards that you need to add to beat the decks that you need to beat, and then cutting from there, more than just like, well, all the cards just look fine, so I guess I'm playing these. Like, what if we just want the other one?
I mean, maybe something like Omnath even, right? Which it kind of does everything, but does it do something that you need it to do specifically?
I think if you're cutting Explore, the card becomes a lot less attractive.
Yes.
Just because this deck's, one of the draws was the fast Omnath.
Yeah, you still get there a little ahead where, like, turn 3 Dryad means on 4 you get to Omnath plus fetch land. But maybe, if you start shaving Explores, then maybe you want 2 Omnath instead of 3, or maybe even just 1 instead of 2. I think the first copy still goes a long way. Like, that is a good Bring to Light target a lot of the time, and there are a lot of games where you're going to get something out of an Omnath, and it's a great card to find. But yeah, I think having that critical eye and not having these sacred cows is very important when you're trying to update these decks to adapt to this new competition.
Yeah, the deck does have a very raw, powerful game going on. I think it's just it feels so static because of what it does that people don't think enough about what's happening.
There's definitely there's a flaw to how efficient it can really be, right? Like we mentioned, this is almost the dinosaur of the format, where it's actually trying to, as we mentioned previously, is getting up to 4 drops and, God forbid, 5 drops, which are meant to win the game in Modern, or so I'm told, instead of packing its decks full of 1-mana interaction. Like, this has 4 prismatic endings compared to 4 Channelers, 4 Ragavans, 4 Thoughtseizers, and, the list goes on from there, and we'd be here all day. So this is a bigger and chunkier deck in that regard. And that's not the end of the world, but it's something it is a weakness, I think. It is a conceptual flaw in a deck that otherwise has a lot going for it.
Yeah. It is. This discussion has just made me think this deck is kind of in a weird spot, and that I should be thinking a lot more about casting Emrakul's than I already was. Well, not casting.
Yes. It's almost like I want to take the infrastructure from the creativity deck and transplant it into something else, but I don't know what that something else would be yet.
Yeah, it's hard because Prismari Command is so uniquely suited for that deck.
Yeah, I guess if it's not also part A of your 2-card combo, then it's maybe not a good enough card on rate, but I'm not sure. There was a 5-color Niv Mizzet deck in one of the events this weekend, and I don't like some of the card choices there. I think the archetype in general might be a trap, but maybe that's a kind of direction you go in, where you're not trying to be a combo control deck, but you still have this kind of bring to light, slam the door shut aspect to it.
Yeah, but then looking at this deck, I kind of wondered why the old Yorion list for this didn't just have a Scapeshift and a Valakut and enough mountains.
That's actually a decent point, right? Like, once you get to the stage of, I don't need every single card to cost 1 more mana than it should because it has to be a gold card for my Niv Mizzet, so my 5-drop becomes even better. Then once you move beyond that conceptual barrier, that's an obvious question to ask yourself.
Yeah, I think the Niv Mizzet decks have all the problems of the Scapeshift decks and then some, which I guess kind of is the reverse, like walking backwards from what I said before. Like that is really where it's coming from.
Mm-hmm. So any closing thoughts on, I guess, which of these decks you would choose or how to build any of these decks moving forward?
I would play the Emrakul creativity deck, but like if there was ever a point where I played a couple matches and I was like, oh, that's a big problem, I might just be instantly off it and back to elementals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that Bring to Light might be in the spot where it can never really be too bad for any given weekend. And so, you register elementals in a field that really wants to prepare for it and you get torp robbed into the Shadow Realm. That can't really happen with Bring to Light, but then that might be like the safe choice where you rest on your laurels and you're not actually looking for what's going to maximize your equity for a weekend, if assuming that, deck choice is perfectly liquid and so on and so forth.
It's a real good 35th place finish for luck.
Oh yeah, if you want to get your deck published because you went 5-2 in the challenge or whatever, then this is a deck for you, for sure.
Yeah, so playing against these decks, what should people know? Like, what are the general things that, aside from some of the archetype-specific stuff like kill this creature, kill Risen Reef, time your kill spells on the Dwarven Mind tokens. What are the strategies that these decks are going to struggle with?
So I think the biggest piece of advice against these combo control decks, I guess you would say, I don't think Elementals cleanly falls in that bucket or any other bucket, but certainly the creativity deck, I would put that label on. If you have some piece of interaction and you're trying to hold it up to interfere with that combo, you need to ask yourself, all right, is this actually going to line up well against that combo now or in the future? And let's say instead of advancing my board, I pass with this interactive spell up. If they don't go for it, what changes over the next few turns? If I don't draw something that really moves the needle there, am I just going to pass the turn again instead of developing my board? Because usually that dynamic favors the combo control deck that is built with those games in mind, where suddenly they end of turn lightning bolt your one threat, and now you're not applying pressure and you're not interacting with them, and you've given them more time to stitch their combo together, and maybe they didn't actually have it in the first place, but in the extra 2 turns that you gave them, by being too scared and too reactive, you've given them time to assemble that. So, if these decks did just fall apart to one piece of interaction, they would not be as successful as they have been. So ask yourself if that one thing is actually going to get it done, and if not, maybe you shove and force them to have it in this narrow time frame, or maybe you find some other plan to catch them off guard. Just be aware of how that dynamic favors you turn by turn.
Yeah, I think this kind of bridges to one of the things I wanted to point out is that you're weak to linear decks because they actually try to kill you. Like we talked about Burn, we talked about Tron. Dimir Mill is just a nightmare for these decks, and that's just because they don't just sit around and play your game of well, I'll kill you if you try to tap out and do whatever else if you don't. They just end the game and don't let the combo control deck play on their terms.
Yeah, so there's an element of, if you had 2 clones of Paolo playing against each other with these decks, what is the kind of platonic ideal of the matchup? How does that go? And then there's also, in practice, those linear decks tend to overperform maybe how they should do against these combo control decks because they can't trick themselves into taking a more reactive or even more proactive line than they should, they can only play one way. They have to do their thing. And so there's something to be said for that, especially if you're maybe new to the modern format or you're checking back in and you haven't played in a while. If you're playing, Mill or Tron or something, sometimes you just get to do your thing, and it doesn't matter if you even know what's going on the other side because your thing is good enough.
Yeah, and sort of in a similar vein, I guess we should talk about Blood Moon against these decks, and kind of like we mentioned how the Izzet deck is a really good Blood Moon deck against these decks because it's just going to, or like in general, because it's just going to kill its opponent. But like Blood Moon is kind of like one of these standalone one-shot kills that doesn't mess around against these decks, except for like sort of does mess around.
Yeah, we talk about like Scapeshift as a one-card combo of sorts that has quite demanding deck building requirements, and it's not actually a one-card combo because you need to get up to 7 lands somehow. Blood Moon often is a 3-mana one-card combo, which I guess don't put too many non-basic lands in your deck or whatever, but Blood Moon, if you can support it, often is so absurdly above rate for what it does that, being a good Blood Moon deck has always been, and probably will always be, a major draw to a deck in Modern. And I think that you can build the Elementals deck in such a way where you don't actually care about it as much as it maybe seems like you should. But if you can fetch basic planes, often Ephemerate plus an Elemental is going to clean up everything else, or Harbinger for Foundation Breaker, if you can fetch the basic forest, can then unlock everything else. The creativity decks are in a weird spot here where Dwarven Mine almost forces them to be built in such a way where they're okay having a bunch of red mana, but then also they are so much worse at being able to fetch for a basic to cast their non-red spells, right? And in order to trigger Dwarven Mine has to be, a mountain with text and not just an actual mountain full stop. So Blood Moon is weirdly good against the kind of mostly mono-red full color deck, more so than the others.
Yeah, and even though you can cast creativity, I don't think any of the things that you would cast creativity on are things that you can generate after a Blood Moon.
Yeah, if you can fetch the island, then you get to Prismari Command, make your treasure, and then parlay that into something else. Or this is where Hard Evidence actually shines a lot, where just being able to cast that in advance on the first turn, maybe, you have that clue token lying around to eventually creativity into whatever your payoff creature is.
This may be some of the draw to the small number of Shark Typhoons that some of these lists have.
Yeah, and I don't think that card scales well in Modern in general, but when it also is your Deceiver Exarch for your Splinter Twin, then it has a lot more appeal to it.
Yeah, I absolutely. That is a great assessment of the card. It's Deceiver Exarch, but you draw a card instead of tapping something?
Something like that. In terms of the rest of the format, so Hammer is still a popular and successful deck. How well do each of these decks line up against Hammer? I was very pleased with how well my Elementals deck lined up against Hammer over the weekend, but the others, I guess, Bring to Light is the worst there because you're just naturally clunkier and, you're not, for other reasons, playing cards that happen to be great against them, where the creativity decks, you want to be playing for Prismari Commands just for what your deck does, and oh, by the way, this card does double duty against one of the best decks in the format.
I think it's just closer than it looks. I think there's a lot of these even against Elementals too. There's these turns where the Hammer deck just kind of forks your removal, and these decks can get really trapped by that setup. Where specifically with the card Pure Steel Paladin, it can be a problem.
Yeah, that card, especially if you're keeping a hand that relies on something that's good against artifacts or enchantments. So one thing that came up a lot for me was I would have a Force of Vigor draw, which, okay, this is meant to line up well against their Urza Saga, for example, and it does. But then if that Paladin goes uncontested, it's so easy for them to just find a line that weaves through whatever interaction I can present. And then eventually Lewis is going to join the party, and it's easy for them to pick a lane, and if you're not in that lane at exactly the right time, then they just plow through you anyway.
Yeah, I was thinking of more about the games where the creativity deck, you have a lightning bolt, and you're this is what I'm going to do to buy time, and then they just play a Pure Steel. and you're like, oh, so they've equipped. It's just the thing where like they play pure steel, they have a hammer, they go to equip the hammer to their non-pure steel thing, and they're either going to have a pure steel or hit you with a hammer. And often, even if you untap and Prismari command the hammer, like that's enough to let them close the game out with random goobers.
Yeah, you want to kill the paladin, but you have to kill the O2 Ornithopter. There's about to be a 10-12 Ornithopter at the very least. So they can definitely put you in binds like that for sure. So against Hammer, I would want to be Elementals. I'd be very happy being Creativity. I wouldn't be so happy being Bring to Light. And if I was going to play Bring to Light again, I would want to put a lot more work into shoring up a plan for that matchup. I think that changes when you get to these Ragavan decks, though, where against them, I think the Creativity deck suffers a lot more. The Elementals deck is good for now, but I think can be exploited there. But I think Bring to Light is naturally just quite well set up against them in a way that they can't do much about.
Yep, agree with all of that.
And then what else is there, really? I think we've covered most of the format at this stage.
I think the Cascade decks are all about the same. I think the Cascade decks they can defeat these decks. Living End is probably a little better against all of them, but all these decks have Teferi and Chalice and a bunch of ways to interact. So, like, the matchup is a bit of an uphill battle on the Cascade side.
Yeah, crucially, Creativity cannot have Chalice because, as many of us have found, putting an artifact in those decks by accident, you're going to Creativity into that and then wonder what happened. But yeah, Elementals and Bring to Light certainly can play Chalice, play some other hate cards if they want to. Again, specifically Living End, you have these weird interactions where, like, Elementals can just evoke a bunch of their creatures for no value on the board, just to park them in the graveyard, so that when they Living End, you just get to kill all their stuff when they come back in. So I would imagine that setup favors the Elemental side, and then the fact that Living End itself can kill Velomachus and or Emrakul while also, presenting a one-turn clock, I think puts Creativity in kind of a bad spot there. And then Bring to Light is somewhere in between, where your deck is like naturally a bit slower, so the Cascade decks of either stripe can run you over a bit faster. But then you get to buy some of that back with main deck or sideboard Chalice, whichever you prefer.
Yeah. And I will caution that Grief is not as good against... Endurance is not as good against Living End because of Grief. I feel like I keep saying this, but like... we talked about Force of Vigor being a good free spell. I think I've harped on this before, but you probably want to diversify your endurances if you are playing Bring to Light.
Yeah, I think Endurance is an addition to a plan that's already good against them as a way to like add an extra 5 or 10% on top. I don't think Endurance can be your only plan, because if it is, and you're playing it just as this reactive card, then it's so easy for them to line up a Grief turn, or even sometimes they put their Living End on the stack in a longer game. You Endurance them, and then it's, all right, I'll cycle a Riverwinder, cycle a Street Wraith, and now my board actually still beats yours when all of this is said and done.
Yeah.
So that's all I've got in terms of these decks and their place in the format. I think we've covered a lot of ground here. You should expect to see all of these decks in some capacity going forward, and probably expect to play one of these decks if you're looking to diversify your play in the format a bit, or you're looking for the one thing that could take down an event on a given weekend. These should be options for you. All of these are strong decks, and I think they all have different pros and cons. So there may be a weekend where like putting in the hours with Creativity 2 weeks in advance actually ends up serving you very well.
I agree on all that. And there's actually kind of a secret like third hidden part of these decks. And it's that they don't play Ragavan or Force of Negation.
Okay, I'm listening.
If you actually look at the current ticket price of all these decks, 5-color Elementals is cheaper than the Izzet deck or like a Cascade deck that has 4 Force of Negations.
Well, there is some variation within here. So the canister list that had like 2 Wrenn and Six, 4 Cavern of Souls, 4 sideboard Force of Negation, 4 Teferi Time Raveler in the main deck, that goes above whatever your rental service limit is pretty damn quick in my experience. And you can pare some of that back, I think. Like, I don't know if Force Negation even belongs in these deck sideboards, so that's where you can chop some of that down. But I would not take that as a blanket statement necessarily.
That's fair. That's fair.
Yeah, the Wrenn and Six to Fairy Angle is still problematic from like a price standpoint, both online and maybe lesser on paper, although still somewhat there as well. But that's enough serious chat for the time being, I think. Let's round out this episode, get us out of here with some nonsense of the week after a short break.
What's up, everyone? Justin Parnell here,
along with Ryan Overturf, and we want to tell you about the single best podcast on the SCG network.
Well, obviously, Ryan, you're talking about the 540.
Indeed I am, and that is the best podcast because we talk about the best format in the history of Magic.
Cube Draft?
Cube Draft.
Every week we go over all things Cube.
We're talking about in-depth reviews of brand new cards.
The best ways to draft and think about Arena and Magic Online Cube formats,
as well as ways to play with your friends,
and ways to play with your enemies.
Also some ways to make your friends into your enemies.
And cardboard takes of a variety of temperatures.
So if you're a fan of structured nonsense,
or if you hate it,
either way, all the same, check out the 540 every week wherever you find your podcasts, and right here on StarCityGames.com.
All right, let's finish out this episode with our nonsense of the week. And it's always nice when the nonsense of the week is also one of the best performers of the week. And in that spirit, let's look at Talisca's Orzhov Artifacts deck, or I can't believe it's not Hammer, might be another word for this.
Yeah, there's some ingenious smiths and absolutely no 1-mana equipment.
Yeah, we're just playing smiths to find artifacts and, do some other stuff there. So the basic concept, I guess, is you want to be playing some of these more expensive artifact payoffs. So this isn't a Lurrus deck because it's a Nettlecyst deck, and Nettlecyst is a great card in the right shell. And we saw some of the actual affinity decks in the early weeks of MH2 leaning into that card. It turns out those shells had a lot of flaws, but I don't think Nettlecyst was one of them. I think that's still a great card which you need to find a home for, and Talisca seems to think they found it.
Yeah, I'm interested in how every creature in this deck is an artifact, which kind of makes sense just based on, I think, the way artifact hate is moving in the format. You're less likely to run into like a Shatterstorm, which really punishes you, and you're more likely to run into like a Nature's Claim and whatever. Who cares if that trades?
Yeah, and in that vein, I want to highlight Aethersworn Canonist. This is a card which is, good main deckable hate against the Cascade decks. Also can just generally interfere with stuff, right? It's almost analogous to Roiling Vortex in that context, where once you start looking for them, you see uses for this card everywhere. So, Bring to Light is shot down by this card, for example, or against Lurrus decks, this stops them from going Lurrus, and then they can still recast Mishra's Bauble because it's non-artifact spells that this applies to, which crucially, that then makes it an asymmetrical hate piece for this deck, right? You can still unload your Portable Holes and your Esper Sentinels and so on, while they're constricted to one spell a turn. But it does mean they can't go, Lurrus into Recast My Ragavan or Snapcaster Mage into anything. It's just Snapcaster Mage. So Canonist just often accidentally does a lot of work against some decks, and then against the Cascade decks or, anyone brave enough to play like Lotus Field or Spell-Based Combo, like this can just end the game on turn 2 single-handedly.
Yeah, I do love to see the sideboard as champions as well, since we're not a Lurrus deck. That card has some good memories associated with it.
Yeah, Affinity, old school Affinity, officially died in 2020 with the loss of Mox Opal, but it had been on borrowed time for a while before then, so that was the main shell for Etch Champion. But that card, phenomenal against, Grixis, Rakdos, Mardu, really any combination of colors that's trying to play fair. Etch Champion is gonna body them, and finally there's a home for that card again. I do adore here the Manriki Gusari in the sideboard with no Pure Steel Paladins or anything. This isn't any equipment synergy going on. This is just so your Urza Saga can find this against Hammer to ruin their day.
No, you got Stoneforge. That's what you can't.
Okay.
You can't,
yes.
It's not a 1-mana equipment. I did lie earlier. There is the 1-mana equipment of Shadow Spear, but that almost doesn't feel like it.
Right, you have...
It's just a third mode of Urza Saga.
Yeah, Stoneforge Mystic usually finding either Shadow Spear or Nettlesis. A little surprised not to see like a Cauldron in the 75 for when your Mystics are not getting attacked.
Well, I know Talisker has been showing up in these top 32s with a bunch of different Orzhov decks, so maybe this is just a holdover from like... Maybe Nettlesis is just better than all those. Maybe that's what it is. Like, when would you need to find a Cauldron when you could just get a Nettlesis?
Yeah, just trying a bunch of stuff, I guess. I do love that Welding Jar protects Tide Hollow Sculler, which usually, like, Sculler is a very fragile card, and you have to put some work into protecting it, and this isn't a Giver of Runes deck or anything like that, but Welding Jar is just a free shield that does the same job.
Can we also talk about the interaction between Esper Sentinel and Aethersworn Canonist, where one of the problems with Esper Sentinel is they just, like, play multiple spells?
Okay.
Yeah. I wonder if that was actually, like, designer intended.
Yeah, it's like if they're casting one expensive spell a turn, then Sentinel's good against that. And if they're casting several cheap spells in a turn, well, then you kind of get them from both sides of that pincer, right?
Yeah. You're going to tax them on every single one.
I love the one cranial plating as well, when you want... Nettlesis is a little clunky sometimes, and sometimes you just need to get busy in the red zone, and plating does that for you. We even have the Amoth Nexuses, right? Where we can't put a hammer on those for a one-hit KO, but plating can still be a one-hit kill on Nexus sometimes, as it was in the glory days of Affinity.
I don't love the 4 Goldmire bridges with Thought Seizures, but...
Yeah, the banner here is a little stretched, I will say. I don't know if the Nexus is actually good here as opposed to some other stuff, but on the whole, on the portable whole, I actually like this shell more than I would expect for a deck that we're lumping in this nonsense category here.
Yeah, I agree. Are we ready to dive into the true nonsense of the leagues and not just the decks that won? Because I have a deck lined up from the leagues for nonsense of the week that I want to get to.
Okay.
We're skipping right over the 17-ticket Elder Deep Fiend Crystal Shard deck and going right to the question, do you know the text on Planebound Accomplice?
So this is a sneak attack for Planeswalkers?
Yeah, it's 2 in a red for a 1/3 sneak attack for Planeswalkers. Which normally sounds really stupid because the point of a Planeswalker is to accumulate counters on it to get somewhere and not just like use it once. But this was played by Fluffy Wolf 2, which if you've been paying attention to Magic Online results, you may recognize as the mono red player, and not like the burn player, like the desperate Heretic Ritual mono red player.
Oh, I've been turned on Blood Moon by Fluffy Wolf many a time. I can testify. Yeah,
so this is yet another turn 1 Blood Moon deck, but it is trying some stuff. And that is Planebound Accomplice plus Luca Coppercoat Outcast is a 2-card combo. Assuming you construct your deck similar to the Luca trick from Standard, where you build your deck with all 3 drops and then you Luca one of them into a coma. Only in this case, it's an Emrakul and you're Luca-ing your Planebound Accomplice, and it only costs 4 mana.
Yeah, these creativity decks, you can't play any creatures other than the one thing that you're trying to get to. With Luca, you can play as many creatures as you want, but there's this artificial mana value ceiling that you have to work around.
Yeah. There's some weird stuff where, like, do you just, like, minus on your Seasoned Pyromancer tokens in some games and just wing it? But, like, the plus on Luca also looks pretty good in this deck with Pyromancer, Magus of the Moon, Bone Crusher Giant. You can plus on Luca to find just, like, anything to throw under the bus for it the next turn. And also just, like, ramping into Luca, like, this self-contained combo of Luca is kind of attractive in that aspect of, like, you can ritual out a Luca, plus it, and then have the thing to, turn into an Emrakul the next turn.
Yeah, Luca almost can be a 1-card combo in the sense that the plus usually is going to find you one of these 3 drops, which next turn you can cast and use the minus on to find your 15 drop. And this is a deck which really was harmed by the loss of Simeon Spirit Guide, I think. We do have 4 Gemstone Caverns in the mana base trying to recapture some of that. But yeah, this is a deck which I don't know if this is playing fair or exactly what this is doing, but this is a unintended casualty of the loss of Simeon Spirit Guide?
No, I think this is literally the intended casualty.
Oh, okay. The turn 1 Blood Moon Gamer?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
Fair enough. Well, you can only keep the Wolf down for so long, so good to see them back at their tricks in the 5-0 decklist dump. A very personable and friendly opponent when I played against them, so good to see them back on the map here. In terms of other nonsense, you mentioned the 17-ticket Elder Deep Fiend Crystal Star Tron deck, which if the Wrenn and Six Teferi piles are too rich for your blood, literally or metaphorically, maybe this is where you go to. This is the equivalent of like the tattered shirt.
Well, to be fair, this is a blue Tron deck, so I don't know if you want to debase yourself like that, but you could.
How offensive do you find the Jagantha in the mono blue deck with 15 colorless lands with the 1 Riverglide pathway as the way to cast it?
I mean, you're not gonna play it.
Is that adorable or is it heinously offensive?
I think I think in the context of Urza's Tower, like, it's really hard to call something else offensive. It's like, yeah, you can tap your Urza's Tower and draw a 5/5.
Yeah, but it's certainly grading on a curve here. If no one would be clamoring to ban Tron if that's the worst thing you could do with it. But so noting that one for the historical record, I suppose. One deck that was not in this decklist dump, but I saw making the rounds in a group chat was John Glimpse for Tomorrow with a transformational sideboard into Reanimator. So the basic concept here, this is by Jose Muniz, who usually is playing increasingly deranged builds of Amulet Titan just to try and feel something again. This is the Jund Cascade package of Violent Outburst, Demonic Dread, joining a bunch of 3-drop discard outlets in Seasoned Pyromancer and Rotting Regisaur, which seems a little bit out of place, but hey, sometimes you just glimpse into a 7/6 and get busy with that. And then your big hits to glimpse into are reanimatable things, like you have Ashen Rider and Archon of Cruelty as this like 8-pack of 8 drops, and then you have Grief and Fury as just good ways to not fall behind, also good things to glimpse into. But crucially, they also fall above the mana value floor for Cascade, which means in post-board games, here's the gimmick, when your opponent is bringing in their Chalice of the Voids and Lavinias and so on, I guess maybe Lavinia's hosing you either way, but scratch that, ignore it. You get to board into 4 Persist, 4 Colligan's Command, and so now, because you have a bunch of these incidental discard outlets, you're not reanimating on turn 2 or turn 3, but you're eventually discarding an Ashen Rider to Seasoned Pyromancer, let's say, or an Archon, and getting to persist that back. You can evoke a Fury, persist that one back, persist back a Grief, and then Colligan's Command, you can either have the discard mode target yourself to discard one of these and then reanimate it. If you have a Grief or a Fury, you can pitch the command to either of those cards, or you can buy and vote one of them back for a second go, or you can blow up their Chalice of the Void or their Tormod Script or whatever it is. You get to use really every part of the buffalo here. So I thought, and because you have 4 Persist now as your only thing that costs 3 or less, you have 4 Persist and then your 8 Cascaders as additional reanimation spells. So this was a really interesting way to create this transformative juke, if you like, out of one of these Cascade decks.
I really liked, I didn't time it, but I was wondering when you would, you just kind of dropped Kolaghan's command in there as part of the plan. I was wondering how long it would take you to explain that one.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to explain there. There's 4 actual modes and then a good 2 or 3 hidden modes that maybe are not immediately apparent.
Yeah, it is. You are allowed to choose a lot of targets with that card.
And that's I have fully exhausted my my reserves of nonsense for the week. Is there anything else you want to mention before we get out of here?
I think that is about it.
Okay, if people want to bring new nonsense to our attention, so we have something to talk about next week and get to keep our jobs, where can they find you first, I suppose?
Tag me on Twitter at ARMLX with your modern nonsense, please. If there's a trophy shot with it, even better.
Likewise, at Domin Javier on Twitter, if it's juicy enough, nonsensical enough, I will retweet it and spread the clout around in as far as I can. And yeah, that's going to do it for the week. So great fun, as always, talking to you all. We will be back in here with more sober analysis and more nonsense of the week. Take care, everyone.